It was a gamble unlike any that we've seen so far in the Ukraine war. On August 6th, Ukraine sent a small contingent of soldiers into the Russian region of Kursk. Early reports suggested that anywhere between 300 and 1,000 soldiers had crossed the border, having broken through the poorly defended Russian fortifications on the front lines to make the journey. Since then, Ukraine has kept pushing. Its soldiers continue to move through Kursk, with some even making their way to Belgorod, and the entire complexion of the Ukraine war has changed. For the first time, Russia is being forced to defend itself on its own territory, a situation that seemed unfathomable in February 2022, when the entire world was shaken by President Vladimir Putin and his special military operation. Ever since that Kursk invasion, there's been a key question circulating in the media and among Ukraine's allies. Why? Ukraine's capture of Russian territory in Kursk isn't so much about holding Russian land as it is about changing Russia's entire approach to the war. After all, it's forced Putin to pull troops out of vital areas in Ukraine to defend Russia, which is a situation that will only benefit Ukraine as the war takes its next dramatic turn. But before we get into Russia and Putin's decision to pull his units out of Ukraine, let's dig a little deeper into what's happening in Kursk right now. In an interview with the BBC on August 13th, a Ukrainian soldier named Tomasz explained some of what happened on August 6th. "We had orders to come here, but we didn't know what they meant," he said while drinking coffee at a gas station inside Kursk. Those orders were surprisingly simple. The evening of August 6th saw a small contingent of Ukrainian troops cross the border between Ukraine and Russia, entering the region of Kursk. Since then, the Ukrainians have advanced rapidly. Those early incursions saw it seize 28 settlements, as confirmed by Russia's Ministry of Defense, as well as the Sudza gas metering station. Owned by Gazprom, which is Russia's largest energy supplier, that station transmits Russian natural gas to the rest of Europe. It's a key part of the country's European energy infrastructure, and now it's under Ukrainian control. Though, as Gazprom itself claims, the emerging satellite imagery of damage to the station doesn't mean that Ukraine has destroyed it. Yet. "We suppressed the enemy's means of communication and surveillance in advance to clear the way," continued Tomasz, who remarked that the entire operation was far simpler than he would have thought. Those comments have been echoed in photos and video footage that have started emerging on the Telegram social media platform in the days since the initial invasion. One such video shows a soldier who claims that months of planning went into the operation, with its goal being to force Russia to move troops to other parts of the front lines. "The element of surprise worked," claims the soldier in the clip. "We entered easily, with little resistance. On August 6th, the first groups crossed at night in several directions. Russia's poorly manned defenses on the border couldn't stop these initial groups. What followed was nothing short of a remarkable Ukrainian advancement into Russian territory. That initial group of 1,000 is now believed to be growing in number, though reports are starting to conflict one another." On August 13th, the BBC noted that Ukraine's President Zelensky is now claiming that Ukraine holds 74 settlements in Kursk. Russia's defense ministry hasn't commented since its initial confirmation that 28 settlements had been overrun, meaning there's little reason to doubt Ukraine's claims. Whatever the case may be, it doesn't change the fact that Ukraine now controls villages and towns inside Russian territory. It's a sharp humiliation for Putin that also changes the entire complexion of the war. Ukraine is also claiming that it now controls about 386 square miles of Russian territory in Kursk, though the BBC says that is a disputed claim. The Institute for the Study of War, for example, says that while Ukrainian soldiers may be spread out that far, it's unlikely that the entire region is under the Ukrainian army's complete control. What is more certain is that Russian civilians are fleeing Kursk in droves. The BBC says that 121,000 have left their homes so far, many on their way to Moscow to escape the war that's coming to their doorstep. A further 180,000 have been told they need to leave, meaning Ukraine's invasion has forced the temporary displacement of nearly 200,000 Russian civilians in the space of a week. Moscow is preparing to welcome as many of those people as possible, having set up 400 shelters across the country that will serve as makeshift homes for up to 30,000 evacuees. But it's clear that the scale of the escape from Kursk is growing beyond Moscow's control. It barely has enough shelters to handle a sixth of the people who've been displaced so far. All of this implies that the Kursk offensive has been extremely successful so far. But that success doesn't answer the question we posed at the beginning of the video. Why did Ukraine choose to launch its invasion now? It's not about taking territory, at least according to Ukraine's foreign ministry. On the afternoon of August 13th, a claim came out that Ukraine was not interested in taking territory, with the supposed goal being broader than that. A spokesperson for the ministry said, "The sooner Russia agrees to restore a just peace, the sooner Ukrainian raids on Russian territory will stop. As long as Putin continues the war, he will receive such responses from Ukraine." So the Kursk invasion is actually about bringing an end to the entire war then? Perhaps it is, in part, but there's a far more immediate and practical reason for Zelensky taking such a massive gamble. Ukrainian troops invading Kursk will force Russia to deploy soldiers it has stationed elsewhere to deal with them, and that action will have a far greater impact on the war than many realize. We're already seeing this happen. On August 13th, a week after the Kursk invasion began, Politico ran an article in which it reported on the comments of Ukrainian army spokesperson Dmytro Likovy. He claimed that the invasion had left Moscow scrambling, forcing Putin to not only express anger, but claim that the West was responsible for the invasion. The Russian president claims that Russia will mount a worthy response to Ukraine's actions, with that response appearing to be pulling troops out of other locations to send to Kursk. Russia has relocated some of its units from both the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions of Ukraine's south, Likovy claims. This move is notable because those regions were among the first that Russia attacked when Putin launched his special military operation in February 2022. Kherson in particular was a major early victory for Russia. Symbolically, it was the first major Ukrainian city to fall to the Russian invasion, allowing Putin to proclaim an early victory in his operation. But perhaps more important is Kherson's location. With a population of 380,000 people, Kherson lies on the banks of the Dnipro River, giving Russia key access to the city via the Black Sea. In the early days of the war, this access was seen as vital. Russia's dreaded Black Sea Fleet will be able to send soldiers and supplies into Kherson via Crimea, allowing Putin to reinforce his armies in South Ukraine. Of course, we now know that the war hasn't played out quite like that, with Ukraine managing to use missiles and drone strikes to take out a third of the Black Sea Fleet. That part of the fleet wasn't rendered completely useless, but Russia is far warier about using it now than it was when it first took Kherson. Still, this proximity to Crimea is important to both sides. For Russia, it's due to the logistical advantages, and for Ukraine, because Kherson acts as a sort of gateway to the annexed territory. Crimea has been under Russian control since 2014, with taking back Crimea likely being a key objective for Ukraine in the war. Kherson is important in that, as Dr. Marina Miron, who researches defense studies at the King's College London, explains, recapturing it would pave the way to reconquering Crimea, which Ukraine aims to do in this war. Back to the city's importance, Kherson offers access to the Dnipro River, a waterway that runs right into the center of Ukraine. Again, that river could serve as a major supply line for Russia as it advances closer to Kyiv from the south. Why does any of this matter in the context of Kursk? Russia removing troops from Kherson means that it's prioritizing the protection of its own territory over the retaking of important territory in Ukraine. It weakens the assaults Russia can carry out on a key Ukrainian city, and one that Russia controlled in the early months of the war, allowing Ukraine to refortify Kherson so it becomes much harder for Russia to retake once it's resolved the Kursk issue. However, it's unknown just how many troops Russia has redeployed. Likovy suggests that Russia has moved a relatively small number of soldiers from Kherson to Kursk, meaning there will still be Russian forces in the city. That could be a miscalculation by Putin. Though Ukraine invaded Kursk with a small number of soldiers itself, as around 1,000 crossed the border, those soldiers have succeeded by creating anarchy in the oblast. Roving units are destroying Russian defenses at small settlements, followed by larger units of Ukrainian troops that secure those settlements and fortify them. A relatively small number of Russian soldiers isn't likely to be able to dislodge the Ukrainian soldiers from their positions quickly. Plus, now that Ukraine has broken through to Kursk, nothing is stopping it from reinforcing those positions it's taken with soldiers of its own. In short, the Kursk invasion has forced Putin into a change of tactics. However, it may not have forced the change that Ukraine wanted. While troops moving out of Kherson is important, Ukraine would have preferred Russia to move soldiers away from the Donetsk region. Al Jazeera said as much in a video published on August 12th, in which it claimed that the invasions of Kursk and Belgorod were intended to change the dynamics in Donetsk by forcing Russia to send troops from that region. That would relieve some pressure on Ukrainian forces stationed in and around that city, which have faced constant bombardment as Russia attempts to secure more territory in the Donbass. But Donetsk remains in Russia's focus. Back in February 2024, Reuters reported that Russia was firing anywhere between 1,500 and 2,500 rockets and artillery shells at the war-torn city daily, with its goal being to take out key infrastructure before winter in hopes of forcing more of the city's population out by the end of the year. Ukraine is trying to hold Russia back in the eastern province. Russia currently holds about 57% of Donetsk, but the constant pressure has been telling. Ukraine wanted to ease that pressure. However, Putin's response of pulling soldiers out of Kherson suggests that won't happen. As Politico points out, Russia has instead tried to counter Ukraine's gains by launching refreshed offensives in Pokrovsk, which is in the Donetsk region, alongside other locations in Donetsk. For now, Russia seems satisfied with pulling troops out of Kherson, along with sending troops from Kaliningrad into Kursk. That's according to Laurynas Kasčiūnas, the Lithuanian defense minister, who claims that Lithuania has spotted Russian troops leaving Kaliningrad in the wake of the Kursk invasion. All of this adds up to a fairly confused response on the part of Russia. Likovy said as much when speaking to Ukrainian TV, noting that Russia launched several attacks on Kherson, even as it withdrew some of its forces to send to Kursk. "We must still understand whether it's a smokescreen activity," he noted. But trying to create a smokescreen could backfire on Putin. If the army is only diverting small numbers of troops to tackle the Kursk problem, with the focus remaining on the Donetsk and Kherson regions, Russia may find itself losing even more territory. A small contingent isn't going to stop Ukraine's advance, especially given how meager the Russian defenses were initially. Those small numbers of troops will run into far stronger Ukrainian fortifications, as well as having to deal with the potential for Ukraine to send more soldiers into Kursk, so these former Kherson units are attacked from both sides. Only one thing is certain: Putin has been forced to change his approach to the Ukraine war. For the first time since the war began, he's not fighting on his own terms. Instead, he's having to respond to a successful Ukrainian offensive that has brought the war into Russia. Regardless of the nature of his response, this is something that Putin neither anticipated nor prepared for, meaning that he's been humiliated as Ukraine shows he hasn't done enough to defend the Russian people. Let's focus back on Kherson for a bit. Though the removal of troops from that pivotal city may seem like a huge bond for Ukraine, the reality is that Russia had already done something similar back in November 2022. Several months after taking Kherson, Putin ordered the withdrawal of many of his soldiers stationed in the city as they stared down a Ukrainian counterattack that they likely wouldn't be able to handle. Ukraine successfully liberated the city 9 months after it was taken. However, Kherson was far from a secure area following this liberation. As AP News reported in November 2022, the departing Russian forces littered the city's streets with landmines that one Ukrainian official noted could render Kherson a city of death. Mikhailo Podolyak made those claims, and another that would turn out to be prescient. Russia would start shelling Kherson intensely after it relocated its troops to the other side of the Dnipro River. That's exactly what happened. As CNN reported in February 2024, the successful liberation of Kherson by Ukraine didn't result in the city becoming a safe haven for its people or a location from which Ukraine could organize attacks against Russian positions in the south. The shelling that Podolyak predicted soon came, with residents describing the level of drones and artillery pounding away at the city to be at the worst levels they'd seen since the beginning of the war. The Dnipro riverside is now lined with trenches, and the endless storm of artillery has left Kherson a broken husk, where broken glass and destroyed buildings line the streets. Pessimism has reigned in Kherson for 2 years. CNN reports that repair workers have taken to making dark jokes, with one saying his team celebrated the 10,000th window they'd boarded up in the wake of the Russian attacks. Kherson may not have become the city of death that Podolyak envisioned in terms of Russian landmines, but Russia has spent almost the entire war ensuring that the city would have no chance of recovery following its forced withdrawal in November 2022. All of which brings us back to the Kursk invasion. Perhaps now we're starting to see more of Ukraine's strategy crystallizing. Zelensky made a huge gamble when he okayed the Kursk invasion. He bet that Russia would be able to do little to stop his soldiers from entering Russian territory and, crucially, that he wouldn't face any blowback from the West for taking the war into Russian territory. The gamble paid off. Ukraine is in Russia, and the West isn't telling Zelensky that his soldiers need to leave. The success of that gamble has forced Putin to rethink his strategy. That's evident in the troop diversions we've spoken of. Russia is weakening its position in Kherson to send troops into Kursk. That's ideal for Zelensky, as Ukraine only intends to hold Russian territory for as long as is needed to achieve its own aims. With Russian soldiers leaving Kherson, perhaps now could be a time for Ukraine to consolidate its position in that city properly and prepare to defend it against future Russian attacks. There's also the Donetsk region to consider. Yes, Zelensky would have liked to see Russian soldiers diverted from that region in response to the Kursk invasion, but that hasn't happened. Yet. Given that we don't know just how many soldiers Putin is sending to Kursk, it's still very possible that Ukraine could fend off the initial Russian response, forcing Russia to divert troops from elsewhere. If Zelensky's luck holds out, that elsewhere could be Donetsk, which would again afford Ukraine time to not only refortify, but to potentially launch counterattacks against weakened Russian forces. But Ukraine may have had other goals with the Kursk invasion. Disrupting Russian logistics could be one of them. As part of the newest invasion, Ukraine has seized a key Russian gas transmission station. It's also taking territory through which Russia might have sent reinforcements into Donetsk. Now around 200,000 people are being evacuated from Kursk, with the region becoming far less useful to Putin. As the Kyiv Independent points out, the incursion could also halt cross-border attacks from Kursk, allowing Ukrainian soldiers to not only regroup, but also redeploy closer to Donetsk to shore up Ukraine's defenses. That means two more goals may have been achieved. Even if Russian soldiers aren't pulled from Donetsk, Ukraine has made it much more difficult for Russia to send reinforcements into the region. And with Russia now trying to retake Kursk, rather than fight Ukraine on its own territory in the north, Ukraine can send more soldiers to Donetsk. If nothing else, the invasion has forced a stretching of the front lines. That's according to ABC News, which wrote that Zelensky's decision to invade Kursk was a bold gamble, given that he was encroaching on the territory of a nuclear-armed country. A country that's made multiple threats to use tactical nukes in Ukraine. Those threats haven't come to fruition, with Putin only able to muster a meager response to the Ukrainian incursion. Evacuations and troop diversions, rather than a nuclear holocaust, have been the results. That's yet another way that Zelensky's big gamble has paid off. It's shown that crossing the final red line and invading Russia doesn't come with the repercussions that Putin claimed it would. Whatever happens in Kursk from this point forth, Ukraine has achieved a symbolic victory against Putin. It's demonstrated that there is a far lighter bite behind the Russian president's nuclear barking, which opens the door for future incursions into Russian territory. It also shows the rest of Europe that Ukraine is still worth backing in this war, and that Russia may not present the level of threat many believed it did in the past. A chink in Putin's armor has been revealed, with the strongman of Russian politics being shown as somebody who doesn't always back up his word. That's not the only chink that Zelensky's gamble revealed. The mere fact that Ukraine was able to launch the Kursk invasion in the first place shows the strategic weakness of the Russian approach to the war. So focused was Putin on achieving his objectives in Donetsk that he failed to secure the front lines in North Ukraine. Arrogance may have played a part here. Putin likely didn't anticipate that Ukraine would even consider an invasion into Kursk or any other Russian territory, leading him to dedicating just enough to the northern front lines to occupy Ukraine in its own territory. That approach has clearly backfired. With Ukrainian forces now in Kursk, the war's front lines have been expanded and stretched, with the result being what we're currently seeing. Russia is having to weaken its positions elsewhere to handle the Kursk problem. Of course, there's a wrinkle to this strategy. Stretching the front lines has just as much of an impact on Ukraine as it does on Russia. Ukraine's commander of the 14th Regiment of Unmanned Drones, identified only through his codename of Charlie by ABC, says as much. The stretching of the front line for us is also stretching the front line for the enemy, he claims. Only we have prepared for this operation in detail. The Russians were not prepared for this operation at all. In other words, Ukraine has accounted for the impact the stretching of the front lines will have. A metaphorical stacking of the deck in Zelensky's big gamble, resulting in the front line expansion working out in Ukraine's favor. There's another way that Zelensky's big gamble has proven to be a strategic masterstroke. It's resulted in the capture of several hundred Russian conscripts, many of whom were only recently installed in Putin's army. That's according to the live tracker Sky News has put in place following the initial Kursk invasion. On August 15th, it reported on claims from Zelensky that Ukraine had captured around 100 Russian prisoners of war during the previous 24 hours, with many dozens more having been caught between August 6th and 13th. That represents a more literal weakening of Russia's front line, as those are soldiers who will no longer be able to fight against Ukraine. Russia will have to replace those captured conscripts, which creates another explanation on why it's diverting troops away from Kherson and other regions to send to Kursk. Finally, there's the major propaganda victory Ukraine has achieved as a result of its Kursk invasion. On August 15th, Sky News published a report on the captured Russians, in which its reporters actually spoke to some of those who'd been captured. It described the detainees as generally being young conscripts, many aged between 19 and 21, who had absolutely no idea how to respond when Ukraine invaded. The men, who were unnamed and now shown in pictures, said that Ukraine's attack happened extremely quickly and they simply surrendered rather than fighting back. They claimed their families had no idea what had happened to them, with some expressing hope that their capture would lead to a prisoner exchange at some point. That's damaging to Putin in several ways. As Sky News points out, he said at several points during the war that conscripts wouldn't be sent near the front lines until they were more experienced. These captures refute that claim. Most people to whom Sky News spoke were young men recently conscripted and placed in vulnerable positions. Not only does this make Putin look like a liar, but it exposes weaknesses in his army. Are Russia's manpower issues so severe that it's being forced to use barely trained conscripts as the first line of defense against Ukrainian forces? The Kursk invasion would certainly suggest so. Worse yet for Putin, his reputation as a strongman has been damaged. That's according to Sky News security and defense editor Deborah Haynes, who says that it's become impossible for Putin to hide this invasion from the Russian people. For a politician, a former spy, who has spent his career building a reputation of being a strongman, to have his country invaded in this way, it must be a huge blow to President Putin. All of this leads us to a final question. What happens next? That question is difficult to answer. The odds seem high that Ukraine is going to fortify its positions in Kursk, ready to fight against the troops that Putin is diverting from Kherson. That fortification could result in more Russian losses, leading to more troop diversions. The longer Ukraine can hold the 74 settlements it's taken in Kursk, the more time it gives itself to take advantage of the stretching of the front lines. That could open the door for more counteroffensives in Donetsk, assuming Putin is forced to divert troops from this critical region, as well as the fortification of Kursk and the countering of artillery strikes that have battered the city for so long. All that being said, Kursk wasn't the objective. It was a gamble played to perfection by Zelensky that's completely changed the layout of the war. Putin is now being forced to respond while facing the humiliation of being the first Russian leader since World War II to allow another country to invade Russian territory. In the end, the damage the Kursk invasion has caused to Putin may be just as valuable as the forcing of troops to relocate. But what do you think? What are the long-term ramifications of Ukraine's invasion of Kursk, and what do you make of Putin's response so far? Could the stretching of the front line open up opportunities elsewhere? Share your opinions in the comments below, and thank you for watching this video. Now go and check out the shocking results of Ukraine's invasion into Russia, or click this other video instead. The footage is too graphic to share here. Russian-covered trucks, estimated to be carrying a company-sized force of soldiers, sit on flat tires, still lined up in the neat, orderly row that they'd been traveling in just hours before. Damage to their vehicles immediately makes it obvious what fate befell them, pockmarked with small holes the size of large marbles. Sometime that morning, as the trucks hurried to bring a company-sized force of reinforcements to counter the Ukrainian invasion of Kursk, a distant HIMARS, high-mobility artillery rocket system operated by Ukrainian soldiers, went into action. It's not known how Ukraine managed to strike with such pinpoint precision miles inside Russian territory. There's growing evidence that Ukrainian hackers were able to break into the Russian traffic camera system, a massive network of cameras that allows for real-time monitoring of road and traffic conditions. This would give Ukraine eyes on every single highway and major roadway in the region, letting them precisely track the movements of Russian forces. Perhaps though it was a simple reconnaissance drone, of the type used in the thousands by both sides. Normally, flying such a drone so far inside Russia would be risky, as its high altitude would make it easier to spot for Russian air defenses, even if small drones remain notoriously difficult to target and track. But Russia would have had a very hard time coordinating any response to an airborne incursion, given the massive electronic warfare blitzkrieg that Ukraine unleashed as its tanks and armored vehicles smashed through the two lines of trenches staffed with conscripts that were all that stood between Russia and a Ukrainian invasion force. Communications were cut off or degraded to the point of uselessness, radars jammed. Many may have tried to warn the ill-fated convoy as it rolled straight into a Ukrainian ambush, but jamming would have made radio communications difficult, if not impossible. Given the disorganized nature of Russia's defense of Kursk, it's likely nobody knew what was waiting for the convoy. Seemingly zero precautions had been taken to secure the movement of troops against Ukrainian precision attacks. Moments after being detected, rockets loaded with hundreds of submunitions were screaming through the sky, bursting open a mile or so from their target and unleashing what Iraqi forces facing American weapons would call steel rain. Vehicles were instantly shredded, and dozens of troops sitting in the flatbeds never knew what hit them. Footage and photos from the strike show soldiers heaped on top of each other inside the trucks, falling over dead and onto each other on the floor of the truck as they were instantly killed. The photos and video would make its way around the internet within hours of being shot. Inside Russia, tight media controls would prevent them from being shown on television news reports or printed on newspapers, but many Russians have long ago adopted alternate means of keeping themselves informed. Platforms like Telegram, VK, WhatsApp, and even TikTok would host videos and photos of the carnage, reaching millions of Russian citizens. Most shocking of all, though, was the fact that this was not footage from the distant battlefields in Ukraine, and it wasn't contract Russian soldiers dead in their trucks. Many of these were conscripts, kids aged between 18 and 24, serving their mandatory year of military service, and they had died a terrible death just meters away from the front lawns of Russian homes. Things would quickly take a turn for the worse. News of the Ukrainian invasion of Russia's Kursk region broke slowly. Tight media controls hamper the flow of information, but the ineptitude of Russian military command, its federal agencies, and a healthy amount of disinformation efforts by Ukrainian intelligence all serve to significantly obfuscate the reality inside the besieged oblast. It would be the evacuation of thousands of refugees that would make the situation irrefutable and bring national attention to the true scale of the Ukrainian attack. Even then though, most military bloggers, a primary source of information for most Russians, downplayed the Ukrainian invasion or dismissed it entirely. After all, anti-Kremlin forces backed by Ukraine had launched raids into Russia before, and each time after snapping a few selfies, they fled back across the border before meeting significant resistance. By day 3 though, it was becoming increasingly clear that the situation in Kursk was much more serious than was originally believed. President Vladimir Putin had dropped the ball, or so it seemed, waiting 3 full days before announcing any plans to organize a resistance to what he deemed a terrorist incident in Kursk. This hints strongly that the Kremlin was completely blindsided and that it was struggling to come up with a realistic response plan to the invasion. Local officials, however, were fully aware of the scope of the disaster, as 75,000 residents fled the fighting in the first few days alone. During one televised meeting, an acting regional governor was chastised and silenced after stating that Ukrainian forces had seized 28 villages and made the situation, quote, very difficult. That public admission of seized Russian towns, however, would resonate across Russia, prompting a wave of fear and outrage across social media. It was difficult to get a clear picture of the situation in Kursk, prompting even more Russians to turn to mill bloggers on platforms such as Telegram. Many attempted to toe the Kremlin line and downplay the situation in Kursk, but others offered a much more sobering and honest account. Russian defenses had either been bypassed or completely collapsed. Troops are being cut off and surrounded. It was a repeat of Ukraine's famous Fall 2022 counterattack, only it was happening on Russian territory. And with growing horror, the Russian public began to realize the real cost of this war, because the casualty reports coming from the fighting were largely made up of conscripts. Russia has had a unique relationship between its people and its government regarding military conscripts. It was always accepted that Russian conscripts were treated poorly, with sexual, physical, and psychological abuse baked into the system, the rule of the grandfathers as it's known. Exploitation of conscripts by senior conscripts, regular soldiers or their commanders was widespread and tolerated, even if they were used for slave labor in local farms or construction sites, with their superiors pocketing the profits of selling their labor. But after the disastrous invasion of Afghanistan, the Russian government set some unofficial conditions regarding its use of conscripts. The high casualties prompted Russian mothers to launch a national movement that threatened serious political turmoil, and the Kremlin would make a social contract with its citizens. If they allowed the government to do as it pleased, it wouldn't interfere much in their lives, and conscripts would not be used to fight outside of Russia. Thus, conscripts have been largely kept out of Russia's expeditionary fighting, though they were used in both Chechen wars and in a limited scope inside of Ukraine. The use of conscripts in Ukraine, however, set off a firestorm of controversy so intense that Vladimir Putin himself met with the mothers of killed conscripts months after the invasion of Ukraine, ensuring them that no more will be sent to the front lines. While there are still reports of conscripts inside Ukraine, it seems that the military has largely kept its promise and honored Russian law forbidding the use of conscripts in expeditionary roles. It's strange that conscript casualties will be so controversial in a society that regularly tolerates truly apocalyptic levels of normal casualties, and even the use of human wave meat grinder tactics. Yet these individuals are contract soldiers, people who chose to be there and accepted the risk, or they're prisoners, serving in the most dangerous positions for a chance at redemption. Russians accept these casualties, even at levels that would prompt an immediate congressional investigation back home in the United States. But Russians are extremely sensitive to the deaths of conscripts, and that's bad news, because as Ukraine forced its way into Kursk, this was largely all that stood in their way. Confusion quickly turned to outrage and grief as media released by Ukrainian forces made its way to the Russian blogosphere. While the public line from the Kremlin and state media was that the Ukrainian assault had been blunted, the truth coming from Ukrainian social media told a completely different story. Trenches of dead Russian soldiers, convoys ambushed by HIMARS and elite Ukrainian special forces, and video after video after video of the capture of huge numbers of POWs, as many as an entire company of soldiers in one single instance. Russian POWs, many of them conscripts, had their hands duct taped over their eyes to immobilize and blind them as they were transported back across the border to prison camps. Interviews with 18-year-old soldiers gave truth to the harrowing tale of their capture. Entire units decimated by far superior Ukrainian firepower, with the survivors quickly attempting to surrender. Once more, it was Russian mothers who were the first to organize, launching a social media movement to bring attention to the plight of conscripts. Within days of the invasion, at least 52 Russian families were inquiring with the Ministry of Defense on the status of their sons stationed in Kursk. A Change.org petition was created imploring President Vladimir Putin to withdraw conscripts from combat operations, citing inexperience and a lack of weapons. Launched on August 7th, the petition had just over 9,000 signatures on August 15th. A full-scale offensive is currently taking place in our territory. Please save the lives of untrained soldiers in combat, read the petition. Unsurprisingly, the Kremlin was silent on the matter. In the subsequent days, even more casualties and POWs would follow. Russia had relied heavily on the use of conscripts on its border, believing that Ukraine would never dare invade Russia thanks to Putin's heavy use of nuclear threats to intimidate the West. These forces had little to no training and very poor equipment. According to one captured conscript, he went to the shooting range only one time and fired 2 rounds. That would be the culmination of his military training before being sent to Kursk to guard the border. Member of the State Duma Andrei Gurylev would try to assuage Russian fears, stating shortly after the invasion that, quote, "In this conflict, conscripts in the Kursk region successfully defended an entire brigade's assault, and not a single soldier was lost." The truth was significantly different from his public statement, and Russia was finding loopholes around its social contract with the Russian people to not send conscripts into combat. Per a Russian source, as conscript forces were being evacuated from the fighting, they were allegedly forced to sign military contracts and sent back into the fighting. The difficulty for Russian forces is the deep integration of conscripts with regular army forces, with units having a mix of contract soldiers and conscripts. This makes it impossible to simply separate the two as they're being prepared to counterattack Ukrainian forces. With the invasion so fresh though, it's unknown what effect this will have on the Russian people, especially as Ukraine continues to gain ground and Russia seems to be scrambling for solutions. A force made up of private military companies, FSB border security forces, regular army forces, interior ministry forces, and irregular forces like Chechen soldiers is being assembled to attempt to stem the Ukrainian invasion. But none of these forces share a joint command structure, and Russia has proven it's extremely inept at establishing clear chains of command and conducting joint operations. Inevitably, this means more casualties on Russian soil, with many of them being conscripts. There has been a sense of outrage as well within Russian society over the Ukrainian attack. Yet while normally one would expect to rally around the flag effect, surging volunteers into the military and popular support for the war, this does not seem to be the case in Russia. Putin has recently announced another round of cash incentives for volunteers, and the Defense Ministry has put out calls for personnel willing to dig trenches and set up defensive fortifications in Kursk with a high pay incentive. The use of high pay packets strongly indicates that despite Russian territory being invaded, the expected surge of patriotic volunteers to join the army has not happened, though the situation is still early and things may change. Indications are, though, that a growing fear has gripped Russian society, as it becomes abundantly clear from how the Kremlin is fumbling its response to the invasion that a new round of mobilization may be inevitable. While gaining ground in the east, Russia has officially lost more of its own territory in 1 week than it took from Ukraine all year long. Much of a massive American aid package signed into law in late spring is yet to arrive in Ukraine, and Western support continues to ramp up, with huge new aid packages announced in the wake of Ukraine's success in Kursk. If Russia is unable to defend its own territory and push out a Ukrainian assault with the forces it has, the public has little illusion about what might come next. Putin, however, clearly fears a fresh mobilization, given how deeply unpopular the last partial mobilization was. The question is, how will the Kursk invasion factor into the public's tolerance of another round of mobilization? And how will they tolerate a 3-day special military operation to take Kyiv that has resulted in the first invasion of Russian territory since World War II? Now go and check out why Ukraine's invasion of Russia has changed everything, or click this other video instead. Ukraine's forces have achieved the unthinkable. They've crossed the Russian border, launching a surprise invasion that left Moscow reeling. The question now echoing in the Kremlin and around the world is, how did this happen? How could Russia, with all its might, have failed in its most fundamental task, preventing an invasion on its own soil? As of this script's writing, Russia's so-called special military operation to reclaim Ukrainian land has turned into a nightmare, 900 days in, and it's Ukraine that's rewriting the rules of this conflict. Even if by the time you watch this video Ukraine has been pushed back across its border, the war has changed forever. But to understand Russia's catastrophic failure, we need to explore a critical factor that has ironically aided its collapse more than any Ukrainian offensive ever could: NATO's restraint. Throughout this conflict, the West and Putin have been locked in a tense game of cat and mouse. The West has cautiously escalated its involvement, delivering increasingly capable weapons to Ukraine. Each time, Putin responded with his usual threat to unleash nuclear devastation, and each time, the West hesitated. The debates over sending modern tanks raged for over a year until Britain finally said, "Hold my tea," and broke the deadlock by sending a few Challenger tanks to Ukraine. Yet despite these breakthroughs, the top-tier equipment came with strings attached. In a bid to avoid provoking Putin's wrath, Western powers imposed heavy restrictions. Weapons couldn't be provided to Russian rebel forces. Ukraine was initially forbidden from launching strikes into Crimea, and any cross-border attacks by Ukrainian forces were strictly off-limits. This was a severe handicap for Ukraine, as Russia exploited its ability to launch attacks from behind the safety of its border, where it was shielded from Ukrainian retaliation. To grasp the absurdity of this situation, picture a boxing match. Ukraine is up against an opponent with a much longer reach, Russia, but Ukraine is forbidden from getting close enough to land a punch, while Russia is free to jab at will. It's not hard to see how this fight could end. Then this past summer, the stakes rose dramatically. Russia began massing troops and equipment just across the border from Kyiv, preparing for a massive offensive. Ukrainian intelligence had warned of a looming assault, but the exact location remained a mystery until the shelling began. With 50,000 troops poised to strike, Ukraine found itself in a desperate situation. But in a surprising turn, President Biden authorized Ukraine to use American long-range munitions to disrupt the Russian advance. For the first time in the war, Ukraine was allowed to strike Russian forces on their own soil. HIMARS rockets, both GMLRS and ATACMS, rained down on Russian troop concentrations, vehicles, and equipment, crippling the Kharkiv offensive. In one strike, Ukraine unleashed over 120 precision rockets, shattering Russian forces on their side of the border. President Biden had given authorization for American weapons to be used in a limited fashion inside of Russian territory, responding to Russian attacks or within a certain distance from the border. This still placed the vast majority of Russian high-value targets, such as airfields, out of reach, but it ensured that Russia could not mass forces on its side of the border without being harassed ever again. But nobody could have guessed how the paradigm would radically shift once again just 2 months later. Even after suffering a defeat in the Kharkiv offensive and taking significant casualties in cross-border missile and rocket attacks, Russia still believed that the old paradigm was still in play. NATO would never dare authorize Ukrainian military action into Russia itself, aside from the use of long-range munitions. After all, Putin had spent 2 years at this point rolling out the old nuclear saber and rattling it, making sure the West would self-deter as much as possible. This brings us to the situation on the Kursk border with Ukraine right before the UAF invasion. To say that Russia has fought this war in extreme luxury would be an understatement. Despite Putin's propaganda that NATO poses an existential threat to Russia, it's not stopped him from stripping troops and equipment from all of his shared borders with NATO countries. Even the Kaliningrad exclave has seen massive drawdowns for service in Ukraine. This is because despite the rhetoric, Putin knows that NATO does not and never did want a military confrontation with Russia. Thus, he's free to leave nothing more than a token force on his borders with NATO. This same understanding stretched to Ukraine. While Russian targets in Ukraine were finally free game for the UAF, Putin's fundamental understanding of the rules of this conflict was that Ukraine would never dare invade Russian territory, and especially not with NATO equipment. Sure, small cross-border raids by separatist groups were an ongoing concern, but these raids were easily rebuffed after only a few days and inflicted barely any political or military cost on the Kremlin. Thus, Russia has historically only secured its border with Ukraine with forces large enough to deter small-scale raids and respond to an eventual skirmish, but not large enough to stop a conventional force looking to seize and hold Russian territory. FSB border security troops and conscripts make up the bulk of Russian border forces and are spread thin as is, far thinner than would be the case in a normal war between two neighboring nations. If this were a normal war, Russia would maintain large garrisons all across its border with Ukraine, along with picket forces meant to detect an invasion attempt that the nearest garrison force would then immediately respond to. Ukraine lacks the manpower to require a full-scale defense of the border, but even this economic strategy would still require tens of thousands of soldiers given the several hundred miles of border between the two nations that's still controlled by Ukraine. However, because Ukraine's hands are tied by its Western partners, Russia doesn't have to secure its border, even with this greatly reduced force level. It's instead free to send those tens of thousands of soldiers and all of their supporting equipment into the front lines inside Ukraine itself, leaving its border secured with far less well-equipped and trained paramilitary forces and conscripts. This has helped put considerable strain on the Ukrainian defenders, who still have to maintain their own border security forces out of fear Russia could quickly assemble an invasion force on its side of the border with little to no notice. And unlike their Russian counterparts, these border forces need to have armored vehicles and air defense systems, or else Ukraine could suffer a catastrophic flanking attack that could threaten to collapse the front. It's easy to see where this is going. Early in August, Ukraine exploited this complacency to stunning success. The second point of failure in Russia's defense of its border came from ignoring reports by its border troops. FSB border troops and their conscript augmentees began reporting unusual Ukrainian activity in late July, growing in concern as they believed that possibly a major raid was going to take place. We likely won't know the real answer until well after this war is concluded and the archives unsealed, but it's likely that Russia ignored these reports out of, again, its sense of complacency. If Ukraine was massing troops on the border, then it was just a ploy to get them to redeploy forces from the front in the east, where Russia was and continues to make incremental gains. However, this being Russia and the full scope of its incompetency now known to outside observers, it's also just as likely that these reports never made it up the chain of command. And if they did, then they weren't shared with the rest of the Russian defense apparatus. Russia lacks a unified chain of command between the FSB, its National Guard, and the regular military, and there's no telling where a point of failure could have occurred, but the opportunities are plentiful. What's clear is that Russia's deep complacency extended even to carrying out surveillance of its wartime border. The Ukrainian invasion went off without a hitch, kept in absolute secrecy until the very last minute, a testament to Ukraine's ability to maintain strong operational security. However, there's simply no excuse for Russia to not have been conducting aggressive surveillance of its border at all times. Russian patrols equipped with surveillance drones should have been sufficient to detect the buildup of forces and raise the alarm. The third point of failure is Russia's unprepared physical defenses. Ukraine took a lot of heat in the Kyiv direction when it was discovered that despite the threat of Russian invasion, local commanders had not strongly fortified against a Russian assault. Yet the difference between the Ukrainian defenses north of Kyiv and Russia's border defenses is significant. Best reporting states that the Russians had set up as much as 2 lines of trenches, but these were very sparingly manned. There were defensive fortifications where Ukrainians met stiff resistance, but upon making contact, the Ukrainian invasion force simply drove past them. Cut off from the rear, defenders were forced to flee, surrender, or put up a doomed last stand. This is best exemplified by the performance of Chechen fighters on the border. There were elements of the Chechen 141st Special Motorized Regiment, also known as Kadyrivets for their loyalty to Chechenya's head Ramzan Kadyrov. Another moniker they go by is Akhmat Special Forces, and they have a fierce reputation, feared even by Russian troops as some of the best, most aggressive fighters in the entire Russian armed forces. At least up until February 24th of 2022. When faced with real combat, these TikTok warriors were soon discovered to break and run more often than not. They repeated this performance in the Kursk Oblast, where dozens of Chechens were captured with Ukraine showing off their documentation as proof, while the commander of local Akhmat forces fled to the safety of the rear. In a TikTok video, he claimed that the reason Akhmat had failed to defend the border is that Ukrainians simply drove past them. Captured Chechen travel documents would say otherwise. The failures to coordinate a defense are not just due to physical deficiencies though, but also critical failures in planning, strategy, and command and control. First, Russia failed to create a realistic defensive plan in case of incursion. Faced with the prospect of defending such a long border with limited troops, Russia would have been better served by creating pickets along the border. Every dozen miles or so and several miles behind the border, rapid response forces armed with drones, armored vehicles, and man-portable air defenses should have been stationed. Upon contact, picket forces would have been instructed to report the attack and break contact, trading very low military value territory for time. Rapid response forces would then be assembled from all neighboring encampments, assembled into a combined force, and sent to counterattack. The combined response force could then fight a delaying action if facing a significantly more powerful enemy, or deliver a counterattack to push invaders back across the border. In the meantime, response forces from encampments further away would have time to assemble, delivering augmentation forces to the front within 24 to 48 hours. This strategy would have served Russia's limited manpower pool very well, given that it would have been possible to fully man the border with multiple defensive lines all fully staffed. However, there's a plethora of reasons it was beyond the reach of Russia. The first is the fact that Russia's current border and regional forces do not share a joint chain of command. This is hardly new, as even inside Ukraine the regular Russian army struggles to perform joint operations between its branches, sometimes even between larger Russian units. Combined arms operations continue to be out of reach of Russia, and especially so in its poorly defended border. With a combination of conscripts and other forces, local commanders found themselves at odds with each other over how to react to the Ukrainian invasion, and the problem persists even a week after it began. Currently, Russia is planning its counterattack to contain the UAF, but this plan is being met with extreme skepticism. The most obvious problem comes from the composition of the forces assigned to Kursk, currently the Russian National Guard, Russian FSB Border Guard Service, Interior Ministry troops, conscripts from the regular army, PMCs, and other irregular forces have all been tapped for the response. All of these share completely independent command structures, and there exists no joint command structure between them. As usual, Russia is having to make it up as it goes along due to a lack of planning, and given their troubles with regular army forces in Ukraine, there's little reason to believe that a Russian response to Ukraine's invasion is going to be well coordinated or particularly effective. Particularly effective does not mean fruitless though. Russia still has a lot of manpower it's willing to send into the meat grinder. Compared to Ukrainian forces though, who by all accounts are made up of hardened combat veterans and experienced commanders, the Russian response is unlikely to be an efficient one. This time though, Russia may not be able to meat grinder its way to victory for one very specific reason. As the Ukrainians invaded Kursk, Russian units were either taken so by surprise, overwhelmed by the violence and speed of the assault, or destroyed in fighting. By and large, the UAF was going up against conscripts, whom by Russian law cannot be used as expeditionary forces outside of Russian borders. This hasn't stopped some numbers of conscripts from ending up in Ukraine, but even Putin has been extremely sensitive to the mass use of conscripts in combat. Shortly after the invasion, he personally met with mothers of conscripted soldiers who had accidentally been sent to Ukraine and has made efforts to prevent it from happening again. These conscripts are notoriously poorly trained and terribly equipped. Even in peacetime, they suffer from extreme levels of physical and sexual abuse, low morale, and very poor quality equipment and training. There's little indication that things have changed in wartime, and Russia's border conscripts have performed as expected, with the UAF taking hundreds of conscripts prisoner and inflicting a yet unverified but seemingly high level of casualties on the rest. Russian troops dying en masse in meat grinder battles of attrition is nothing new. What is new, this time, is that photos and videos of dead conscripts are making the rounds on social media, but they aren't dying in distant battlefields, they're dying on the front lawns of Russian homes. One infamous example is a HIMARS ambush of a Russian reinforcement convoy, with the convoy destroyed directly in front of a row of Russian homes. Visual estimates of the casualties count around 36 dead. Ukraine states that as of the writing of this script at the end of the first week of the invasion, it's taken 2,000 Russian prisoners of war. And there's little reason to doubt this figure is more or less correct, given the number of videos and photos shared via Telegram and other social media. In these videos, we can see Ukrainian forces detaining groups of up to 24 at a time, with one video showing 30 individuals surrendering at once. Normally, it's prudent to be wary of media manipulation. This is a war after all, and social media is a powerful tool. But the depth of Ukrainian penetration into Russian territory and the wealth of evidence strongly hints that the Ukrainian figures are more correct than not. There's also mounting pressure from the Russian population itself concerning conscript deaths and capture. A movement meant to bring awareness to the killing and capture of conscripts quickly grew in popularity shortly after the start of the invasion, spearheaded by Russian mothers concerned for their own children conscripted into the military. Putin seems to be aware of the sensitivity of conscript deaths within the Russian population, an odd occurrence for a society with an extremely high threshold for pain in terms of regular war casualties. Ukraine may have been counting on this, with conscript deaths and captures feeding into its strategy. Many have wondered at the purpose of the invasion, with some criticizing it for taking troops away from a front where Ukraine is being steadily pushed back across many sections. Yet the death of Russian conscripted youth is already achieving an effect that scores of dead Russian contract soldiers isn't. The casualties are only likely to mount though, as reports are that only small amounts of forces are being pulled from the front as of the writing of this script. Instead, it seems like conscripts will play a role in the attempted retaking of Kursk, and the fact that the Kremlin seems to have no real plan does not bode well for these forces. It took 3 days for Putin to react to the Ukrainian invasion, a sure sign that nobody in this chain of command had a plan in place to deal with such an incursion. When Putin did respond, it was immediately clear that there still existed no plan for countering the invasion. The mixed nature of the planned response is indicative of how poorly prepared Russia was and continues to be. Please leave your thoughts in the comments section, and thank you for watching the video. Ever since Russian President Vladimir Putin launched his special military operation against Ukraine in February 2022, the war has been marked by a brutal stalemate. Russia floods Ukraine with soldiers and equipment, while Ukraine valiantly defends its territory, occasionally launching counterattacks to reclaim lost ground. For nearly 30 months, this grinding conflict has followed a predictable pattern, largely because Ukraine was restricted from using Western-supplied weapons against targets inside Russia, a move that could have escalated tensions in Europe to a dangerous level. That's all changed. In a dramatic shift, US President Joe Biden, backed by other NATO allies like the UK, has given Ukraine the green light to strike back directly on Russian soil. This bold decision shatters the so-called red line that had held Ukraine back, and is setting the stage for a turning point in the war. Ukrainian forces have crossed into Russia, targeting the strategic region of Kursk. This marks the first time since the war began that Ukrainian troops have moved beyond their own borders. So what does this mean for Putin? Why Kursk? And most crucially, what could this development mean for the future of the Ukraine war? Let's dive into these questions, starting with the most pressing one. What on earth is happening in Kursk? On August 6, 2024, Ukraine broke through the thin Russian line of defenses separating Ukraine from Kursk, allowing its soldiers to enter Russian territory for the first time. This breakthrough went underreported on the day that it happened, possibly because media outlets were taking a wait-and-see approach under the assumption that Russia would quickly push the Ukrainian forces back. That isn't what happened. A day later, The Guardian was among the first to properly report on the incursion, noting that the fighting in Kursk had entered its second day, with reports suggesting that Ukraine's forces had managed to advance up to 9 miles away from the border and deeper into the Kursk Oblast. That incursion had been made possible by a highway running north of Sverdlikovo, a Russian border village that also happens to be close to a key natural gas transmission hub. While those reports were unconfirmed at the time, The Guardian pointed out that both official and unofficial Russian sources were claiming that the incursion had happened and that it appeared to involve several hundred Ukrainian soldiers who had taken advantage of the fact that the border between their country and Kursk is one of the most lightly guarded, from the Russian perspective, on the entire front line. Russia was quick to claim that it had already neutralized the incursion. Its defense ministry claimed the incursion was neutralized on the day that it happened, only to backpedal by the time The Guardian released its report to claim that it was ongoing as of lunchtime on August 7th. Russia also provided details on what it had done to counter the offensive. It says using missile strikes and artillery, it destroyed 50 armored vehicles and inflicted 260 casualties on the Ukrainian forces. Ukraine remained tight-lipped about the entire operation. On August 8th, several other media outlets picked up on the story. These included Le Monde, a French news website, which claimed that Ukraine had actually sent 1,000 troops into Kursk, rather than the previously reported several hundred. It also reported more details on what Ukraine did once it crossed the Russian border. Backed by more than 2,000 soldiers that stayed on the Ukrainian side, defending their position and perhaps preparing to follow the initial 1,000 into Kursk, Ukraine crossed the border with 10 tanks and 20 armored vehicles. That immediately casts aspersions on Russia's claims to have destroyed 50 armored vehicles, showcasing just how difficult it is to ascertain full details of what's happened so far. Once Ukraine crossed the border, Russia declared a state of emergency in Kursk as soldiers advanced on several localities, including a small town named Sudza. These localities were bombarded with Ukrainian missiles and drones, reportedly causing at least 5 deaths and over 30 injuries. Furthermore, the August 6th incursion had resulted in fighting breaking out in Oleshnya and Goncharivka, both in the Kursk Oblast, with Russian soldiers in the latter region supposedly being surrounded and captured by Ukrainian forces. The next day saw Ukraine advance further, according to Le Monde, resulting in the capture of around 20 poorly defended Russian villages, including Gornal, Daryuno, and the previously mentioned Sverdlikovo. Those captures also led to Ukraine taking control of the Sudza gas station, a gas transfer point overseen by Russian energy giant Gazprom that represents one of the few entry points for Russian gas into the Ukrainian gas transmission system. This station matters because it's key to Russia being able to transport gas into Europe, meaning the taking of the station will put a small dent into Russia's profitable energy market. NPR also published a report on August 8th detailing the incursion. It backed Le Monde's claims of 1,000 Ukrainians entering Kursk, noting that the number comes from General Valery Gerasimov, who is Russia's chief of general staff. It also noted that it was the first such offensive carried out by Ukraine. Though it had previously backed small groups of Russian exiles as they carried out limited cross-border raids, the incursion into Kursk was the first time that Ukrainian soldiers had entered Russia since the war began. Putin was left with egg on his face. After spending so much of the war trying to portray Russia as an indomitable power to which Ukraine would crumble over time, he now finds himself having to explain why he's allowed Ukraine to take Russian territory. To rub salt into his wounds, the incursion is far from over. At the time of writing, Al Jazeera is running a live tracker covering the Ukraine war, which says the Ukrainian soldiers are still fighting Russians in Kursk. That tracker also contains a quote from Mikhailo Podolyak, a Ukrainian presidential aide, who pins the blame for the incursion on Russia. The root cause of any escalation, shelling, military actions, forced evacuations, and destruction of normal life forms, including within the Russian Federation's own territories like Kursk and the Belgorod regions, is solely Russia's unequivocal aggression, he wrote in a social media post. Al Jazeera also offers a different number for the tanks that have crossed the border, 24 instead of 10. So the details are still blurry. What we can say for sure is that Ukraine is in Kursk and that it's taken up to 1,000 soldiers over the border into Russia. Those soldiers are accompanied by tanks and armored vehicles, in addition to seemingly having access to missiles and drones. They've used these weapons well. Up to 20 small Russian villages are apparently under Ukraine's control, however temporarily that control might last, along with a key Russian gas station. All of this brings us to another key question. Why did Ukraine choose Kursk? That's a question that the White House has been asking. On the evening of August 7th, the US think tank, the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, published an update on the incursion. It confirmed that US intelligence indicates that Ukraine has penetrated at least 2 of Russia's defensive lines on its sojourn into Kursk, as well as taking a stronghold. It also cited both satellite imagery and geolocation footage to apparently confirm the reports that Ukraine has taken dozens of captives and that it now controls the Sudza gas distribution station. These early reports have prompted the White House to contact Ukraine's leadership to quiz them on the objectives of the incursion. Speaking on August 7th, Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, noted, "We're going to reach out to the Ukrainian military to learn more about their objectives." She also pointed out that the White House supports what she calls common sense actions to stop Russia's attacks. Perhaps the use of the term common sense is a subtle indicator of what the US thinks about the incursion. After all, there appears to be little immediate military value to taking the territory within the Kursk Oblast outside of taking the previously mentioned gas distribution station. And even then, the value is minor. That station sends gas into Ukraine and has likely seen minimal use since the war started. Digging deeper into Kursk itself further demonstrates how it appears to hold minimal strategic value. Though the oblast covers 11,582 square miles, it only contains 1.061 million people, meaning it's far from one of Russia's major population centers. You could argue that its hilly surface and multiple ravines could provide some tactical advantage to Ukraine, assuming it wishes to use Kursk as the launching point for further incursions into Russia, but that seems unlikely. A force of 1,000 isn't what a country sends when it intends to take over an entire oblast. Kursk is a center for agriculture, with farms covering around 77% of its territory and mostly growing sugar beets and wheat, with some fodder crops thrown in for good measure. But again, that's nowhere near enough value to justify an incursion through which Ukraine intends to permanently hold the territory it's captured. Which brings us back to the question, what is Ukraine's goal as it moves deeper into Kursk? The answers don't necessarily have to do with Kursk itself, with the oblast simply being the most convenient available to allow Ukraine to achieve its objectives. Rather, as the BBC explains, the goal may be an entirely different piece of territory, Donetsk. Donetsk, which is part of the wider Donbass region, has been a key target for Russia ever since Putin's special military operation started, and symbolically the Donetsk region is somewhat tied to Russia. A large portion of its people are ethnically Russian and speak Russian as their primary language. Granted, those ethnic Russians don't make up the majority of Donetsk's population, unlike what we saw in Crimea in 2014 and beyond, but there's certainly a Russian influence in the region. After all, as DW points out, it was in Donetsk and the surrounding regions that opposition to Ukraine's 2004 Orange Revolution and the Maidan protests of 2013 and 14 were strongest. The Donbass itself has been no stranger to war even before Putin invaded Ukraine. 2014 saw pro-Russian separatists proclaim both Donetsk and Luhansk as people's republics independent of Ukraine, likely with the goal of integrating them into Russia. The point here is that Donetsk offers symbolic importance to Russia. With that symbolic importance comes a continued push to take the region since the beginning of the war. That's why Russia has committed so many soldiers to Donetsk. Tens of thousands of Russian troops have been poured into the region, with Russia also focusing on developing a nearly impenetrable front line through which it pushes against increasingly weakening Ukrainian resistance. Glide bombs pepper Donetsk daily, with the taking of Donetsk setting the stage for Russia's later successes in overtaking the fortress towns of Avdiivka and Bakhmut. In short, Russia is dedicating a ton of its resources to Donbass and Donetsk in particular, which makes what's happening in Donetsk all the more interesting since Ukraine entered Kursk. Speaking to the BBC, a military analyst named Mikhailo Zhirokov points out that Russia has been forced to redeploy some of the soldiers it had stationed in Donetsk following the Kursk invasion. If you look at the official reports, he claims, there were significantly fewer Russian glide bombs dropped in the Donetsk area. That means the aircraft which carry them are now elsewhere in Russia. Elsewhere is likely Kursk. Ukraine's Kursk incursion has been a success in terms of pulling Russian forces away from a region in which they were previously focused. That may have been the goal all along. Throughout the course of the Ukraine war, Russia has succeeded in focusing the brunt of the fighting in areas in which it wants to take. That's logical, as the invading force, Russia essentially forces Ukraine to react by sending troops to whichever areas on which it focuses. This natural ebb and flow of the war has resulted in Russia leaving scant defenses across some areas of the front line it shares with Ukraine. The northeastern borders, which Ukraine crossed to enter Kursk, were some of the most minimally defended of all. So what we're likely seeing with the Kursk incursion is Ukraine forcing Russia to divert troops away from regions that Russia considers a priority. In creating those diversions, Ukraine weakens the Russian front lines in Donetsk, perhaps opening the door for counterattacks against Russia's offensives. If nothing else, the diversions offer a reprieve to Ukrainian soldiers near Donetsk, who are being bombarded by Russia's glide bombs, giving them time to regroup and reorganize their defenses. Ukraine is essentially keeping Russia honest. It's forcing Putin to realize that he can't be complacent when it comes to taking on Ukraine. Any weakness he displays, such as not reinforcing the front lines near Kursk, can be exploited by Ukraine and used against him. That brings us to a secondary reason why Ukraine may have moved into Kursk. Ukraine is showing that it, along with many of its supporters, is unafraid of crossing a red line. We touched on this earlier when we talked about how several Western nations are allowing Ukraine to use their weapons to attack Russia in its own territory. Perhaps the Kursk incursion is an extension of that. Ukraine will not only fire missiles behind the front lines, but it will actively take Russian territory to show Putin that it's just as capable of invading and fighting within Russia as Russia is of invading Ukraine. Interestingly, Ukraine may even have a modicum of support from the US with this incursion. Though the US is still seeking answers from Ukraine, as we mentioned earlier, the White House also pointed out that the restrictions the US has in place for the use of its weapons in Russia's territory haven't changed. Tellingly, White House spokesman John Kirby went on to say that the Kursk incursion was not a violation of our policy. So the US is looking for common-sense answers, but Ukraine's actions are very unlikely to cause any tensions between it and its most powerful Western ally. So we have two potential reasons for the Kursk incursion so far. Ukraine has used it to stretch Russia's forces along the front lines, potentially relieving pressure in Donetsk. And also it may be using the incursion to showcase just how far it and its Western allies are now willing to step over the red lines that previously prevented Ukraine from doing anything but defend itself against Putin's special military operation. But there's another reason why Ukraine may have chosen now to take territory in Kursk: negotiations. In May 2024, reports started surfacing about Putin being ready to end the Ukraine war through a negotiated ceasefire that would recognize the front lines at the time. From that ceasefire, Russia would enter deeper negotiations that would likely see it try to claim the Ukrainian territory it controlled at the time. That would have seen it essentially take much of the Donbass, including Luhansk and Donetsk, as well as southern regions such as Mariupol. In other words, Russia had a powerful negotiating position. No matter how faltering its invasion of Ukraine may have been, it had still successfully taken territory and was now ready to end the war, claiming that territory permanently. Reuters noted that several sources inside the Kremlin believe Putin was ready to push for these negotiations. One of the 5 it spoke to claimed, "Putin can fight for as long as it takes, but Putin is also ready for a ceasefire, to freeze the war." Putin himself had practically said as much during a May press conference he held in Belarus, in which he said, "Let them resume," when talking about the possibility of negotiations opening. However, that resumption could only happen if the negotiations were based on the realities on the ground. Ukraine would have to cede territory for Russia to stop, and worst of all, Ukraine had no leverage that it could bring to the negotiating table. With the taking of around 20 villages and a key gas distribution system in Kursk, Ukraine now has leverage. It's possible that Ukraine has taken this territory intending to hold it for the long term. If that's the case, we'll see more troops funneling into Kursk in the coming days. Remember that Ukraine sent an extra 2,000 to support the 1,000 who entered, and more territory taken. Should Russia and Ukraine enter negotiations while Ukraine still controls this territory, it finally has some leverage to bring to ceasefire talk. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky could tell Putin that he would be willing to trade the territory in Kursk for some of the Ukrainian territory Russia has taken. Whether that approach would work, or if Russia would be willing to enter negotiations when Ukraine controls some of its territory, remains to be seen. Which brings us to the final big question we'll ask in this video: what comes next? Russia's response, for one thing. In the immediate aftermath of the Kursk invasion, the oblast's regional governor, Alexei Smirnov, declared a state of emergency. He claimed the move was necessary to eliminate the consequences of enemy forces coming into the region. Air alerts were issued over Kursk, with Russia scrambling fighter jets, which the BBC says were filmed flying low to the ground over the region on the hunt for Ukrainian soldiers. This footage lends credence to Mikhailo Zhrokov's claims that Russia was diverting fighter jets from the Donetsk region to handle its Kursk crisis. Meanwhile, Ukrainian politicians have found themselves just as curious about the reasons behind the incursion as everybody else. Speaking on Facebook, Alexei Honcharенko, a member of Ukraine's parliament, claimed the attacks has led to the taking of territory before adding that he didn't know what the plan was. However, he claimed it would show Europeans and Americans that Russia can and needs to be attacked. Again, the message here is to support Ukraine in crossing even more red lines. After all, this is the first time since World War II that any Russian territory has been occupied by an opposing force. And as Honcharенko points out, Putin did not turn to nukes and so on. meaning Ukraine is showing the world that the world should not be scared of escalation or the reaction of Putin. Another humiliation for Putin. Despite all of the threats he's made during the war, which have included threats of deploying tactical nuclear weapons, red line after red line has now been crossed. Now he has Ukrainian troops in his territory, and he hasn't followed through on any of his threats. Is that because he's smart enough to know that going nuclear would lead to World War III, or is he not following through on his threats because he knows that Russia couldn't handle a war with NATO and the US after having depleted itself so thoroughly in Ukraine? Back in Russia, Andrei Belyusov, who became Russia's defense minister in May 2024 after previously serving as the country's first deputy prime minister for 4 years, faces his first major test. Part of passing that test appears to be taking part in the Kremlin's efforts to turn the incursion into pro-Russian propaganda. Putin is spearheading this campaign, claiming on the second day of the incursion that Ukraine's actions were not only a major provocation, but that its soldiers were firing indiscriminately at civilians, their homes, and Kursk's public buildings. Those claims aren't yet confirmed. Militaristically, Russia has clearly sent forces into Kursk to push back the Ukrainian advance, though it's unclear how successful they've been. Valery Gerasimov, Russia's chief of general staff, claims that Russia is continuing to destroy the adversary in areas directly adjacent to the Russian-Ukrainian border. That's a statement vague enough to suggest that Ukraine is still in Kursk and Russia hasn't been able to repel the 1,000 soldiers in the territory just yet. Even worse for the Kremlin is that these public claims of pushing back Ukraine are being disputed on Telegram, which is Russia's most popular social media channel. Several pro-war channels on the network claim the situation is far worse for Russia than the politicians are claiming. One such channel, Rybar, says that the situation is continuing to deteriorate, while noting that Ukrainian formations were advancing towards towns. Again, those claims aren't confirmed either. It all adds up to a confused state of affairs, in which we know Ukrainian soldiers are in Kursk, but we're still uncertain exactly how successful or otherwise they are following the initial taking of villages and a gas distribution station. Add claims of captured Russian soldiers into the mix and you get even more confusion. An August 9th report in the Kyiv Independent claims that drone footage published by Ukraine shows 32 captured Russian soldiers, adding that the Telegram post that showcased the footage claimed that a further 8 were out of frame. More claims were being made, but they offered yet another example of claims that can't be verified independently. What is clear is that the Kursk incursion shows a change in Ukrainian tactics. For over 2 years, it has bedded into its own territory, fortifying to enable it to defend against slow Russian advances. That approach has proved lethal for Russia. It's lost 588,540 soldiers since the start of the war, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Defense. But now, whittling away at the seemingly never-ending stream of soldiers Putin is sending into Ukraine isn't enough for Zelensky. The incursion into Kursk shows that Ukraine is willing to go on the attack, which will send shockwaves throughout Russia as Putin realizes that his country is no longer safe behind the front lines of the Ukraine war. That change in approach could lead to consequences for Ukraine in the long run. That could especially be the case in Africa, where the BBC claims Ukraine has been trying to win allies during the war with Russia. Over the last 3 days, Mali and Niger have both cut diplomatic ties with Ukraine, ostensibly over comments by a Ukrainian military official who suggested that Ukraine may have played a role in the killing of several dozen Malian soldiers in July 2024. Those soldiers were working alongside mercenaries from the infamous Wagner Group and were apparently killed in clashes with Al-Qaeda-linked militants. Andriy Yusov claimed in the immediate aftermath that the separatist rebels the Malian soldiers fought received the necessary information they needed to carry out their attacks. An unsubstantiated comment, but one that has triggered Mali, Niger, and Senegal to cut ties with Ukraine, all coincidentally right as Ukrainian troops entered Kursk. It's possible that the Kremlin put pressure on all three to do so, with Ukraine calling Mali's decision short-sighted and hasty, while claiming that it complies with all aspects of international law. Perhaps Ukraine wasn't involved in the killing of Malian troops at all. Instead, we may be seeing Russian influence-based politics at play again, as it labels Ukraine as the aggressor while using the Kursk incursion to prove its point. Ukraine loses 3 potential African allies, or at least 3 countries with which it could deepen diplomatic ties, and Russia forces a small propaganda victory. That's all conjecture, but it shows that Ukraine's differing approach to handling Russia could have ramifications on a wider scale. What isn't conjecture is that Ukraine's latest actions aren't part of the Russian plan. None of this is. The special military operation in Ukraine was supposed to be short, sharp, and devastating. Now Russia is bogged down in a protracted war that has not only cost it hundreds of thousands of soldiers and huge amounts of military equipment, but is now seeing it lose territory to a country that it's trying to conquer. The plan is failing. And with that, we'll ask you what you think about Ukraine's incursion into Kursk. Is this the start of a new approach that will see Ukraine taking even more Russian territory in the future? Or is it a short-term crossing of a red line designed to stretch Russia's troops? How do you think Putin will respond to the humiliation he's experienced as a result of this incursion? Share your thoughts in the comments section, and thank you for watching the video. It's August 6th, 2024. The date marks the first time that Ukraine's pilots have started flying F-16s, an event that many see as a potential turning point for the Ukraine war. Granted, the limited number of F-16s provided to Ukraine by its Western allies won't allow it to establish full aerial superiority over Russia. But now it has options. Localized superiority is possible, as are aerial attacks on Russian encampments and even Russian territory. It's a big moment for Ukraine. But soon the arrival of F-16s is going to be overshadowed by Ukraine making a move that nobody expected. Ukraine is about to invade Russia. Specifically, its forces are going to break the front lines to the north of the country and pour into Kursk, a Russian oblast that is sparsely populated and even more sparsely defended. Russia hasn't placed much importance on the region, instead preferring to focus most of its invasion efforts in Donetsk as it continues a slow push toward Kyiv. But the night of August 6, 2024 changes everything. Ukraine officially holds Russian territory. In this video, we're going to explain why Ukraine's invasion of Russia has changed the entire complexion of the war, to the point that Putin may never fully recover, and explain why it's such a crucial event. But before we do, we'll start with a quick recap. On August 7th, reports started circulating that Russia had supposedly repelled a group of 300 Ukrainian fighters, supported by tanks, that broke through the front lines in the north of Ukraine and entered Kursk. Russian officials claimed the Ukrainian offensive resulted in 5 deaths and 20 injuries, but the implication was that it had been successfully fought off. The implication was wrong. As more details emerged about Ukraine's unexpected foray into Russian territory, it was quickly revealed that this was no small attack. For Russia, the situation was far from controllable, despite the words of Kursk regional head Alexei Smirnov. Instead, Ukraine hadn't just gotten into Russian territory, it was advancing at a rapid pace. Intense fighting marked August 8th, with more details rapidly emerging. The French news outlet Le Monde revealed that Ukraine's incursion involved as many as 1,000 soldiers, with a further 2,000 backing that initial group up from behind the Ukrainian border, and that the invasion was of a far larger scale than Russia claimed. It has also been remarkably successful. Ukraine had pushed 9 miles into Kursk, taking 20 villages along the way. Among those villages was the small town of Sudza, which is home to a gas transmission station that Russia used to send natural gas to the rest of Europe. Far from controlling the situation, as Smirnov claimed he would, the Kursk regional leader instead declared a state of emergency. Thousands of Russians have been evacuated from their homes so far, indicating that Russia has failed to prevent the Ukrainian advance, despite all of its claims to the contrary. The advance has continued to August 13th, the date of the scripting of this video. Between August 8th and now, Ukraine has launched multiple drone and artillery strikes against locations in Kursk. It's also advanced even further into Russian territory. August 9th saw the Institute for the Study of War claim that Ukraine had pushed on from the initial 9 miles it had captured, with its soldiers advancing as far as Kromskaya Baiki, which is over 21 miles into Russian territory. That day also saw Ukraine officially confirm the invasion, with the country having remained tight-lipped during the initial 3 days of fighting. More attacks followed in the coming days. Russia claimed that the UK was helping Ukraine with its invasion, with State Duma member Adalby Shagashev saying that English had been heard among the soldiers. That isn't confirmed, and it's just an indicator of just how much chaos Ukraine's forces are spreading throughout Kursk. The strategy was also unfurling. Ukraine was sending small groups of soldiers into villages, bypassing Russian fortifications in the process before fighting and withdrawing to attack elsewhere. Those small groups were being followed by larger ones, which consolidated and kept the territory the smaller groups attacked, as Russia's forces found themselves further spread out and confused. This was no quick raid. Ukraine was actively capturing and keeping territory in Russia. Russia responded by sending more forces to the Kursk region, diverting soldiers who had previously been on the front lines in Donetsk in an effort to tackle the emerging problem. Those diversions haven't stopped Ukraine. Over the last few days, it's expanded its incursions to include the Belgorod region, another Russian oblast close to the Ukraine border, which is now seeing small groups of Ukrainian troops launching attacks and taking territory. Today, there may be as many as 6,000 Ukrainian soldiers occupying territory inside Russia. Over 76,000 civilians have been evacuated, with many en route to Moscow, and Ukraine is claiming that it continues to take territory. On August 12th, Commander Alexander Syrsky, who is one of Ukraine's leading military minds, claimed that Ukraine controlled 28 villages and a staggering 386 square miles of Russian territory. Ukraine had taken a massive gamble with this invasion. Faced both with encroaching Russian forces in Donetsk and the possibility of international blowback over it finally taking the role of aggressor in its fight against Russia, it rolled the dice. It gambled that it would not only be able to get away with fighting in Kursk, but that it would also successfully capture Russian territory without Putin resorting to nuclear weapons. It also gambled its relationship with its Western partners. Crossing the final red line had the potential to anger some of the countries that have provided weapons and financial support to Ukraine. The gamble paid off. Ukraine officially holds Russian territory. And even more worrying for Putin, he's had to watch as his forces have crumbled, and the responses that he's attempted to muster have not only failed to dispel Ukraine's forces, those responses have also failed to stop Ukraine from pushing even further. The Kursk invasion has changed everything. Putin has suffered the biggest humiliation he's ever experienced as Russian leader, and it's a humiliation from which he may never recover. Why? It all starts with exposure. Ukraine's actions in Kursk have exposed Russia's military as being far weaker than anybody anticipated. Of course, you could argue that the entire war has been a cavalcade of this type of exposure for Russia. When Putin first launched his special military operation in February 2022, much of the world assumed that it would be over quickly. After all, Russia had a far larger, and on paper, much stronger military. Even today, Russia has 1.32 million active military personnel compared to Ukraine's 900,000, with rounds of conscription leading to more being called up as needed. Russia has more than 10 times the number of aircraft, as well as 13,000 more tanks and more than 139,000 more armored vehicles. It should have steamrolled through Ukraine, even with the military support Ukraine is receiving from Western nations. Instead, we've seen a protracted war in which Russia has failed to establish any sort of aerial dominance. As the Journal of the JAPCC points out, Russia quickly started losing not only its outdated Su-25s, but also its far more modern Su-30s, Su-34s, and Su-35s when fighting Ukraine. The losses were so bad that Russia resorted to launching aerial attacks from behind the front lines. It uses glide bombs, old Soviet-era bombs fitted with a modern wing mechanism, to assault Ukrainian fortifications rather than risking its helicopters and fighters. That shouldn't have happened. With its aerial might, Russia should have been able to support its troops on the ground with precision strikes from its fighter jets, but it's failed to do so. Russia has also lost about a third of the Black Sea Fleet to Ukrainian missile and drone strikes, meaning the small naval component of the war that should have been in Russia's favor has become largely irrelevant. On the ground, Ukraine's Ministry of Finance claims that Russia has lost around 594,400 soldiers, along with nearly 8,500 tanks, over 16,000 armored fighting vehicles, and around 16,800 artillery units. Then there's the increasing reliance on Soviet-era equipment. Reports suggest that Russia has resorted to using old T-55 tanks, which are 65 years old and far from capable of serving in direct assaults against Ukrainian positions due to their thin steel armor being easily penetrable by even basic rocket-launched grenades. That's without mentioning the more modern drones and weapons Ukraine has been using to take out Russian tanks. In short, the entire war has offered humiliation after humiliation for Putin, with his increasingly aging stocks of equipment failing to achieve the victory the world assumed would have happened long before now. Fast forward to today, and the Kursk invasion further exposes Russia's weakness. It shows that Russia has failed to properly fortify the entire front line, which stretches around 620 miles. To the north, in particular, Russia didn't dedicate enough manpower or equipment to guarding the front line, allowing a small contingent of Ukrainian soldiers to break through and enter Kursk. It was too focused on Donetsk and too complacent elsewhere. Now it faces attacks on its own territory that would have been unimaginable when the war began. It gets worse for Putin. Not only does Russia face attacks in its own territory, but it's failing to fend them off. Ukraine is advancing through Kursk, as well as encroaching into Belgorod. Russia is actively losing villages and townships, showing that its faltering attacking might is matched by a lack of proper defenses behind the front lines. From there, add the lack of Western response to these attacks. None of Ukraine's allies have come out to oppose the strikes, with the biggest response being a request from the White House for Ukraine to provide details about its objectives for the Kursk region. That's more bad news for Putin. It shows that the West believes he's too weak to do anything about Ukraine invading Russian territory. Now, Putin's threats, which he has repeatedly failed to follow up on, seem even weaker than they did before, as the Russian leader instead faces the humiliation of allowing a war he started to come to his doorstep. All of this brings us to the second reason why the Kursk invasion represents a pivotal moment for Putin as Russia's leader. It represents the crossing of the final red line in the Ukraine war. These red lines are the actions that have been taken throughout the war that the West believed would provoke Putin into further action. Providing military aid to Ukraine was considered a red line at the war's beginning, leading to several countries choosing to only offer non-lethal equipment. That red line has since been thoroughly crossed. Ukraine has now received over $121 billion in aid from Europe, along with about $82 billion from the US, with more incoming. Other supposed red lines included the installation of NATO infrastructure in Finland and Sweden, which is now extremely likely given that both have become NATO members since the war in Ukraine began, and Western countries allowed Ukraine to use the weapons they provide in Russian territory. All of those lines have been crossed. Putin has done nothing about them. With Ukraine's advancement into Kursk, the final red line in the Ukraine war has disappeared, and Putin quickly revealed that he will once again do nothing in response. At least he'll do nothing to the West. For all of his bluster about what such an incursion could mean in the context of a global war, Putin has barely been able to summon defenses against a few thousand Ukrainians within his border. Ukraine continues to advance as Putin looks weaker than ever. The invasion is a humiliation. It's something that not only should have never happened from a militaristic point of view, as Russia was supposed to be so strong that Ukraine would never break through the front lines, but it's also an invasion that represents humiliation for Putin geopolitically. His lack of follow-through on his threats throughout the war has shown the West that Russia's leader likely believes that his military isn't capable of taking on the rest of Europe. And psychologically, as the Atlantic Council points out, this crossing of the final red line also strikes a powerful blow against enemy morale. Russia, having already seen its military fail to defeat Ukraine quickly, now has to contend with mass evacuations and the panic that comes with having an invading force in its own territory. Putin's failures have forced his people to experience a taste of the medicine he's trying to deliver to Ukraine. The result is a growing lack of appetite for the Ukraine war in Russia itself. This was revealed by Euronews in December 2023 when it reported on a poll conducted by the independent company Chronicle. That poll discovered that support for the Ukraine war in Russia had nearly halved since a similar poll conducted in February 2023. Speaking to 1,199 adults across Russia between October 17th and 22nd, the Chronicle found that those who expressed consistent support for the war dropped to 12% from the previous result of 22%. What's more, 40% of those surveyed supported Russia's withdrawal from Ukraine, even if Russia's war objectives weren't achieved. The poll also revealed that 33% of Russians were against exiting Ukraine now that Russia is there, but even that number fell substantially from the 47% seen in February 2023. These dismal numbers, from Putin's perspective, were recorded before Ukraine invaded Kursk. With the final red line disappearing into the distance, it's only logical to assume that even more Russians will now want the war to end because they're scared that their homes could be next on the Ukrainian agenda. And as if to add all of these problems for Putin, America's response to Ukraine's actions has been flippant at best. Beyond the previously mentioned inquiries from the White House, August 13th saw President Joe Biden tell reporters in New Orleans that the invasion is creating a real dilemma for Putin. While the US has been quick to deny any involvement in the operation, "We had nothing to do with this," said White House spokesperson Karine Jean-Pierre. This is far from the response Putin would have wanted. The US should have been on Ukraine's back from the moment it crossed into Russian territory. It was meant to warn Ukraine that this was an escalation that couldn't be tolerated, while telling them they needed to get out and only fight to defend Ukrainian territory. None of that happened. So Putin is left with a situation where the West isn't trying to stop Ukraine from invading, which tells him and the Russian people that the West isn't afraid of Russia anymore. The tentative approach taken at the beginning of the Ukraine war has evaporated. The red lines are all crossed. Putin has done very little in response other than continue his special military operation, and the Russian president's humiliation runs deeper. He's even had to deal with his own people losing their appetite for the war, even long before it arrived in their country. Russian morale is low. Putin's position as a strongman in Russian politics is now on shaky ground. And even worse for Russia's leader is that there are even more issues that the Kursk invasion has caused. Issues like Ukraine forcing Russia to change its strategy. As the National Interest pointed out in an article on August 10th covering Ukraine's high-stakes gamble, the incursion into Kursk may have been as much a strategic play as it was a move designed to expose Russia's weaknesses. On August 1st, Al Jazeera reported that the last week of July 2024 saw Russia launch the largest assault in 8 months within the Donetsk region of Ukraine. That assault was successful, as it led to Russia claiming several Ukrainian settlements and brought Russia closer to cutting off key supply lines that are helping Ukraine's troops fight against it in Donetsk. With those supply routes cut off, Ukraine would be forced to withdraw from the region en masse. Donetsk has been a key Russian focus for much of 2023 and into 2024. Earlier in the year, it managed to take Avdiivka, which many saw as a key Ukrainian fortification. That followed the taking of Bakhmut in May 2023, a similar fortified location that was key to Ukraine's defenses. Through these advances, it's clear that Russia is attempting to slowly take territory in Ukraine's east and south. By taking these fortified towns, Russia can press its advantage because it now has multiple launching points for offensives in southeastern Ukraine. August 4th brought with it more bad news for Ukraine in Donetsk. The country was forced to order the mandatory evacuation of children, along with their guardians, from Donetsk's eastern region in the face of Russian advances. More villages were falling, and more locations were being bombed. Ukraine has been standing on the edge of losing one of its territories for months now. Russia has even claimed that it successfully annexed Donetsk back in 2022, even though it still doesn't have full control of the territory. Why does any of this matter in the context of the Kursk invasion? Russia's advancement through Donetsk had forced Ukraine into a position where it couldn't make any significant breakthroughs in the south or east. Russia's forces are simply too strong in those regions, with Russia also sending a seemingly never-ending supply of manpower to the region to fortify the positions it takes. Enter the Kursk invasion. By committing so many people to Donetsk, Putin failed to properly supply the troops occupying the northern front lines. That paved the way for Ukraine's forces to break through and into Russia. Now that Ukraine is in Kursk and taking territory itself, Russia will be forced to divert forces away from Donetsk to defend itself. Forces and equipment will have to go north to fight back against the invading forces in Kursk, with much of those resources coming from Donetsk. Thus, Ukraine gains new opportunities. It weakens the fronts in the south and east of its territory, opening up the possibility of counterattacks that could allow it to reclaim some of the territory Russia has taken in Donetsk. It also forces Putin into a strategic rethink. For the entire war, Putin has operated under the assumption that Ukraine posed no threat to Russia. He could afford to dedicate more troops to one region than another because all the fighting would take place in Ukraine. So what if the front lines to the north were poorly equipped? Even if Ukraine pushed them back, it would never break through and actually enter Russia. Except it would. And it has. The Kursk invasion has changed the entire complexion of the war in that regard. Now Putin has to account for the possibility that Ukraine will enter other areas of Russia, meaning he can't afford to allow any sort of weakness across the front line. On a practical level, that means Russia is going to need more soldiers and more equipment, the latter already being an issue, given that the country is relying on Soviet-era equipment and is rapidly seeing its stockpiles dwindle. The alternative is that Russia will have to spread its troops further across the front lines of the war. While that will strengthen some areas, it'll also mean pulling soldiers away from regions that Russia wants to take. The result is likely going to be a net loss, as Russia is less effective in the areas in which it wants to advance because it's being forced to guard itself against Ukrainian incursions elsewhere. For the first time since the war began, the issue of where the fighting takes place is no longer in Putin's control. Ukraine had taken the initiative and shifted the war's momentum in ways Putin couldn't have anticipated. He was happy to keep throwing soldiers into the meat grinder while whittling away at Ukraine's defenses in Donetsk. That's still an option, though it comes with the ever-increasing threat that Ukraine will break through elsewhere. That brings us to another way that Ukraine's Kursk invasion has changed everything. It's the first time since February 2022 that Ukraine has had any leverage. In May 2024, Reuters reported that several sources within the Kremlin believed that Putin was open to negotiating a ceasefire with Ukraine. One of those sources, who remained anonymous, claimed that Putin can fight for as long as it takes to claim Ukraine, but Putin is also ready for a ceasefire to freeze the war. Putin himself seemed to confirm this when quizzed about the source's comments while in Belarus, saying that peace talks could resume, but only if they were based on the realities on the ground. This was Putin's way of telling the world that he would have all of the leverage in any negotiations that took place. Russia had already taken much of South Ukraine and was advancing deeper into the Donbass. He was in a position of power. Putin could set the terms because Ukraine had no leverage aside from the aid it was receiving from the West. That changed on August 6th. Ukraine now controls 28 villages in Russia, and is still advancing through Kursk, along with a key gas transmission station. If negotiations were to begin now, it would finally have something to hold above Russia. Ukraine could ask for Russia to withdraw from some of the locations it's fortified in Donetsk in return for Ukrainian soldiers withdrawing from Kursk, for instance. That leverage couldn't come at a better time for Ukraine. It faces the possibility of Donald Trump being re-elected as US president, which creates uncertainty that isn't helped by Trump's claims that he could end the Ukraine war within a day if he was elected. Nobody knows what that means, and Ukraine is rightfully wary of what a change in the political structure of the US could mean for the support it's receiving from America. That uncertainty is compounded by events in Europe, the National Interest points out. Several European countries that support Ukraine are due to hold elections, or have already held them, in 2024. Leadership changes could create problems for Ukraine, as those changes lead to the re-examination of support these countries are delivering. Add to that the fact that Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán now holds the European Union's rotating presidency. Orbán has maintained ties with Putin throughout the war, to the point where he would be considered something of an ally to Russia. As recently as July 2024, the Hungarian Prime Minister traveled to Moscow and shook Putin's hand in what Orbán calls a peace mission. This is a man who already blocked the EU from sending $55 billion in aid to Ukraine in December 2023, and it's very likely he'll argue to continue for the EU to limit the funding it provides to Ukraine in the future. These changing political tides must worry Ukraine. So by taking territory in Kursk, it's working to minimize the impact that changes in European or US politics might have. That's bad news for Putin. He was likely relying on his friendly relationship with Orbán to limit the support the EU could provide, while hoping for political turmoil in the US to do the same. He didn't account for Ukraine gaining leverage outside of its Western allies, meaning he has to face up to the fact that his position at the negotiating table has changed. He's still in the driver's seat if negotiations do occur, but now he would likely need to concede territory in Ukraine to regain the lost territory in Kursk, essentially setting the slow advances made in Donetsk back again. And this brings us to the final reason that the Kursk invasion has changed everything about the Ukraine war, why it's such a massive humiliation for Putin, and why he may never recover from the situation. Putin has lost his strongman image. We've touched on this concept already. In politics, a strongman is a leader, typically authoritarian, who not only claims to have strong popular support, but relies on military enforcement to maintain their control. Through that military support, they're able to claim themselves as the only person who is capable of solving whatever a country's problems may be. In Putin's case, that problem has changed over the years. Earlier in his reign, he tackled issues related to Russia's economy, but from the late 2000s through to today, that problem has evolved to focus on Russian sovereignty. Putin's invasion of Georgia in 2008 saw him cast himself as the strongman while waging war against another nation. The same goes for the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Putin was taking back territory that rightfully belonged to Russia, according to his own political dogma. The Ukraine war was meant to be an extension of Putin's strongman position, reinforcing him as the leader for life in Russia. Instead, Ukraine has whittled away at the image Putin has so carefully crafted. By crossing red lines, it's shown that Putin's bark is worse than his bite, which is a message that Europe and the US have taken on board. By staging such a solid defense against the far larger Russian forces, Ukraine has also demonstrated that Putin's military threat isn't as powerful as once thought. The Russian military is increasingly looking like a paper tiger, a military that looks strong on paper, but is far weaker when put to the test. With Ukraine's invasion of Kursk comes yet another chink in the strongman's armor. For so many years, Putin has positioned himself as the protector of the Russian people, a man who would ensure they came to no harm, even as he pushed aggressive policies externally. That image has been shattered. Thousands of Russians are being evacuated, and Ukraine is driving deeper into his country. Even if Russia manages to push Ukraine out of Kursk, Putin faces a political future in which doubt can be cast on his leadership. That doubt is the enemy of the authoritarian leader, and it could slowly lead to Russia's people losing confidence in Putin. He isn't helping himself. As The Guardian pointed out in an article on August 13th, Putin easily won Russia's presidential elections in March 2000 and has held on to power with an iron grip ever since. But it's now over 24 years later, and Russia finds itself staring down the barrel of a gun that represents so many of the problems it faced when Putin first took power. There is war, just as there was in September 1999, when Russia was bombing the Chechen capital of Grozny. Only now, the war is on a grander scale, and Russia is finding itself fighting on its own territory for the first time since World War II. As for Putin's response, it's been lackluster at best. At the time of the writing of this script, we're entering the 9th day of the Kursk invasion. Ukraine isn't being pushed back. If anything, it's gaining more territory, showcasing how poor Russia's defenses are. And the best Putin can muster is a promise to provide a 10,000 ruble handout to those who are affected. That amounts to $109, a pittance for people who are now facing losing their homes. The strong man has been brought to his knees by the Kursk invasion. Only time will tell if he is able to get back up, or if Ukraine's invasion of Kursk truly stands as a pivotal moment in Putin's presidency. With that, we turn the questions over to you. What do you think the situation in Kursk means for the Ukraine war and Putin's future? Will Ukraine launch further invasions on the back of this success, and is it possible that Putin will be forced to the negotiating table in the wake of these events? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. For the first time in over 2.5 years, Ukraine is fighting Russia on Russian territory rather than its own. This is big, and it could change everything. A massive red line has been crossed, and Putin now has to face up to the possibility of further encroachment, as a war that he started has not only come to his country's doorstep, but has barged through the door and is wrecking the sitting room. On August 6, 2024, Ukraine broke through the shabby Russian front lines, guarding the country's Kursk region, and launched an invasion of its own. The rules of engagement have changed. But what actually happened? How has Ukraine's invasion into Russian territory progressed since it began? How is Russia responding? And most importantly, is this the beginning of the end of Putin's war? Our military experts are here to talk about it today. We start with what we know so far. Initial reports of Ukraine's invasion scrambled to find information. The Guardian, one of the UK's leading newspapers, was among the first to offer details, noting that a report from a Russian military blogger claimed that Ukraine had broken through Russian defenses and was now up to 9 miles into the Kursk region and advancing further forward. That initial report, which came a day after Ukraine launched its invasion, also noted that Russia claimed to have launched an immediate response. The military blogger being quoted said that Russia had used a combination of aerial and missile strikes, along with artillery fire, to inflict around 260 casualties on the Ukrainian forces, while also taking out 50 of their armored vehicles. How true those claims were is yet to be verified. Even if they were true, the Russian strikes seemed to do little to slow down the advancing Ukrainian forces. Le Monde, a French news website, followed up with a report of its own on August 8th, in which it provided more details about the Ukrainian forces that entered Kursk. It noted that around several hundred Ukrainian soldiers had made the border crossing, bringing with them at least 10 tanks and around 20 armored vehicles to launch bombardments on several small towns in Kursk. Sudza was a key target. It was struck with missiles and drone attacks that resulted in at least 5 deaths, more than 30 injuries, and a state of emergency being declared that forced its citizens to evacuate. Le Monde also says that the initial incursion of a few hundred may have just been the start, as over 2,000 Ukrainian troops had amassed on their side of the border before the attack was launched. The French news site echoed The Guardian's claims that Ukraine had gotten up to 9 miles deep into Russian territory, while adding further details. Ukraine's invasion had resulted in it gaining control of around 20 villages, along with the Sudza gas station. The latter represents a major coup for Ukraine. The Sudza gas station is used by Russia to transport natural gas to the rest of Europe. By taking control over that station and the pipelines that feed into it and away from it, Ukraine makes it extremely difficult for Russia to continue doing business with other European countries. Furthermore, given that the station sends gas to Ukraine, it may even be able to partially control the flow of precious resources into its own territory. From about this point, it became clear that Ukraine's invasion wasn't a mere smash and grab. Rather than briefly entering Russia to wreak some havoc before retreating behind the border, Ukraine was taking territory and advancing with a remarkably small contingent of soldiers to send Putin a message. We can enter your territory and wage war just as you have against us. Live trackers started cropping up, with Sky News launching one of the most detailed. From August 9th, it had reported on Ukraine's actions and the impact they're having. Interestingly, that day saw an underreported secondary assault by Ukraine on Russian territory, as a massive drone attack occurred in the Lipetsk region of Russia that disrupted power supplies, caused explosions, and wounded 9 people. A reinforcement of the Ukrainian message that it's now happy to attack Russia inside Russia, perhaps. August 9th also brought news of further advancements. The Institute for the Study of War said it had geolocated footage showing Ukraine may have advanced as far as 21.7 miles into Kursk, as well as offering some insight into the tactics the Ukrainian forces were using. The several hundred that crossed the border had divided into small armored groups, which would bypass Russian fortifications and engage soldiers directly before withdrawing. Rather than consolidating control through these advances, the armored groups would then move on to other fortifications. Thus, Ukraine is sowing confusion among the Russian ranks. The small groups attack and then leave, moving on to the next target. That leads to reports among Russian soldiers in the region that it has to deal with these smaller groups, only then to be blindsided by larger Ukrainian groups that move in, consolidate positions, and hold them. It's an effective disorientation tactic that's causing Russia's collected forces to spread out while they're being harassed and assaulted by the other groups. It was also on this day that the first accusations of Western involvement started to fly. A senior Kremlin official claimed that the UK had been involved in Ukraine's incursion. A member of the State Duma, Adalbi Shagashev, said, "Britain participated in all such sorties. English was heard." There is no official confirmation of this, with the claim likely building on Britain permitting Ukraine to use the weapons UK supplies in Russian territory back in May 2024. Again, it's extremely unlikely that British soldiers are working with Ukraine in Russia, though the claims reinforce the state of confusion Ukraine has managed to create with such attacks. More images started to emerge from the incursion. These included pictures of a decimated convoy of Russian armored vehicles, with the monitoring group Deep State claiming that Ukraine had destroyed 13 of the vehicles in a strike. All the while, Russia's defense ministry claimed that it was continuing to repel the Ukrainian advance, even as it became clear that Ukraine was driving deeper into Kursk. On August 11th, official acknowledgement of the incursion came from the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. For the first 5 days of the assault, he had been tight-lipped, likely fielding calls from Ukraine's Western partners, inquiring about the invasion and its purpose. He may also have kept quiet to gauge the response, both from the international community and Russia itself. Finally, he seemed to confirm his approval of the incursion, stating, "Ukraine is proving that it can indeed restore justice and ensure the necessary pressure on the aggressor." A reason for the Ukrainian invasion made clear: it allows Ukraine to heap pressure on Russia and may potentially give it more bargaining power at the negotiating table in the future. August 11th also saw more Ukrainian attacks. Russia claimed to have shot down 14 Ukrainian drones, along with 4 Tochka-U ballistic missiles over the Kursk region. But Russia didn't achieve a shutout. Officials in Kursk claimed the strikes injured 13 people after a Ukrainian missile struck a 9-story building. The day also brought news that Belarus was sending troops to the border it shares with Ukraine, likely as a deterrent to ensure Ukraine doesn't get any ideas about launching a similar invasion into the territory of one of Russia's key allies. Reports also started circulating in Ukrainian media that the country's forces had entered the Belgorod region. Located to the north of Kyiv, a Ukrainian region that has seen intense fighting since mid-2024, Belgorod would represent Ukraine expanding its invasion to include several Russian regions. A video of 5 Ukrainian soldiers emerged, all standing outside a building in Belgorod, who delivered the following message: "I wish you health. The 252nd Battalion is in the village of Poroz, Belgorod Oblast. Glory to Ukraine." The village is 25 miles from the Ukrainian border, though it's still unclear exactly when this video was filmed or if it was shot as part of the Kursk invasion. Either way, it's damaging propaganda aimed at Russia, showcasing that Ukraine has the ability to attack multiple targets on Russian soil simultaneously. This news was followed by more reports later in the day, which claimed that 4 people were injured in the shelling of a small town in Belgorod. The Ukrainian invasion was expanding. By this point, Russia's response had switched to one of indignation. Its defense ministry hit out at the Kursk invasion, labeling it barbaric and claiming that it served no militaristic purpose. Of course, this response ignores the fact that the same could be said of Putin's special military operation, which has led to Russia controlling around 38,600 square miles of Ukrainian territory. The Russian Red Cross also started evacuating people from the Kursk region, with the organization claiming that it had received 3,000 calls in less than a day following Ukraine's incursion. Russia also imposed what it called a counter-terror operation in the border regions of Kursk, Bryansk, and Belgorod, and there are no real details about what this operation entails. Zelensky rounded out the day by further justifying Ukraine's invasion. "Artillery, mortars, drones," he said. "We also record missile strikes, and each strike deserves a fair response," Zelensky said when explaining why Ukraine had launched an attack on Kursk. All told, Zelensky claims, the region was responsible for almost 2,000 cross-border strikes against Ukraine during the summer. But perhaps the biggest news to come out of August 11th was that Ukraine appeared to be sending even more troops into Kursk. Sky News reported that up to 6,000 Ukrainian soldiers may have crossed the border, dividing their attention between Kursk and Belgorod, which implies that Russian attempts to reinforce defenses at the broken front line had failed and that Ukraine was making a concerted effort to take and retain Russian territory. Come August 12th, and the invasion was still ongoing. Russia started to evacuate more regions, following up on those in Kursk, with more evacuations in Belgorod. It was unclear just how widespread the evacuation was, though word of it came from the region's leader, Vyacheslav Gladkov. These evacuations could also be seen as confirmation of the footage mentioned earlier, and that Ukraine was widening its invasion of Russia to include more than just Kursk. Belgorod was also placed under a missile alert, again suggesting that a Ukrainian assault was imminent if it wasn't already taking place. Later in the day, it was confirmed that 11,000 people had been removed from the Krasnoyarsky district of Belgorod. More drone attacks had taken place overnight, with Russia claiming to have shot down 11 drones over Kursk and 5 more over Belgorod. Reports didn't confirm whether any of those drones had managed to reach their targets before being destroyed. More rhetoric emerged, with Putin claiming that Russia needs to dislodge the Ukrainian invaders, while Russian state TV showed footage of Kursk residents fleeing their homes and receiving first aid. As is so often the case, Russia had started using the invasion to create propaganda, with it being likely that Putin was using this opportunity to further cast Ukraine as the villain while attempting to cement his position as leader. Other claims, such as those made by Kursk governor Alexei Smirnov, emerged, with Smirnov stating that Ukraine had used chemical weapons during its invasion. Those claims haven't been independently verified. So where does all of this leave us? Ukraine's initial invasion of Kursk has evolved from a small operation involving several hundred soldiers to an all-out assault that might include as many as 6,000 Ukrainians crossing the border. Ukraine now controls dozens of villages in Kursk, along with the important Sudza gas station, and its forced evacuations and declarations of states of emergency throughout the region. Worse yet for Russia, it's clear that Ukraine isn't going to stop at Kursk. The last couple of days have seen it launch attacks in Belgorod, and it's likely that Ukraine has already taken territory in that region as well. Russia's defenses have crumbled under the invasion, with fortifications failing to hold up, Russian soldiers surrendering en masse, more on that later, and a complete failure to send any viable response. The lack of response has only allowed Ukraine to roam deeper into Kursk, meaning Russia continues to lose territory. We come to another question. What does Ukraine's Kursk invasion mean for Putin and for the future of the war? Starting with Putin, there's only one thing that can be said. He's been humiliated by Ukraine's actions. For almost his entire leadership, Putin has attempted to cast himself as a strongman. That's vital in Russian politics, as the country has always preferred a strongman leader, who portrays themselves as somebody capable of preserving the Russian Federation. Putin's image has taken a severe knock due to the Ukraine war. Not only has he failed to take Ukraine after 2 years of fighting, exposing the outdated tactics Russia's army uses in the process, but he has allowed another country to invade Russia. Yes, he's trying to use that invasion to cast Ukraine as the bad guys in the special military operation, but he's doing that out of desperation because he's now the strongman who buckled at a key point in Russia's history. The Kursk invasion marks the first time that Russian territory has been occupied since World War II. Back then, the threat came from a massive German military that had already run roughshod over the rest of Europe. Ukraine's invasion is far different. It's a much smaller nation, less than a third of Russia's size. And yet it's not only managed to break through the front lines to get into Russia, but it's actively capturing territory and advancing. More than 100,000 Russians have been forced to flee their homes, according to ABC News, a fact which again rattles Putin's reputation. Those 100,000 people, whatever their opinions on the war may have been, should have been able to rely on Putin to keep them safe. Now their confidence in their leader will be shaken as they face potentially losing their homes in an invasion that they likely believe never should have happened. Of course, Putin has come out with more of the threats he's levied since the beginning of the war. On August 12th, he claimed that Ukraine was trying to undermine Russian stability with the invasion and that its actions would be met with a worthy response. Exactly what that response would be and why it's taking so long to formulate wasn't covered. Troops have been deployed, claimed the country's defense ministry, with heavy tracked vehicles being sent to Kursk to create blockades. But again, Ukraine continues to advance, and buoyed by its success in Kursk, it's also invading other border regions in Russia, with Putin seeming to be able to do little to stop them. Yet more humiliation. War has come home to Russia. On August 13th, around 200 displaced Kursk residents arrived in Moscow, which sits about 326 miles from Kursk. Moscow is now home to 400 temporary accommodation centers, which have been rapidly created to house up to 30,000 displaced residents. An admirable internal response, perhaps, but yet another humiliation for Putin. The war was never supposed to go this far. Ukraine absolutely shouldn't have made its way into Russia, and certainly shouldn't have had enough of an impact to force Russians to flee their homes. Putin's humiliation doesn't end there. In addition to being forced into a position where he has to try and explain away the fact that Ukraine successfully invaded Kursk, he also faces a dire situation within his own military. Russian soldiers have apparently surrendered en masse to Ukraine rather than stand their ground. Some of the first reports of these surrenders came on August 8th, when the New Voice of Ukraine reported on footage and images released on social media platforms that appeared to show Russian troops captured by Ukraine. The video that came with these reports appears to show up to 40 unarmed Russian soldiers, all holding white flags as they are hurried along a highway that leads to Ukraine. Those are 40 Russian soldiers who were supposed to stand and fight. Soldiers who had fortified locations in Kursk were supposed to defend the region's villages. It would be one thing if these soldiers fought to the death. Putin could at least claim they gave everything to defend their fellow countrymen. But the fact that they've surrendered so quickly exposes Russia's military as being incapable of handling a small invading force that initially numbered only a few hundred people and at best is now up to 6,000. Yet another humiliation for Putin. More reports of Russian soldiers surrendering followed. August 12th, the Euromaidan press was claiming that Ukraine had caught Russia so severely off guard that the 40 Russian soldiers shown in the previously mentioned social media footage was just the start. Just 6 days into the invasion, Ukraine had apparently captured an estimated total of 300 Russians in Kursk, all of whom surrendered rather than choosing to fight against the enemy. Those surrenders have likely played a large role in Ukraine's success in Kursk so far. It holds almost 24 villages and a gas station, and it continues to march forward. That wouldn't have happened if these villages were properly fortified and Russian soldiers stuck around to fight. So not only does Putin have to deal with the perception that he's filling the Russian army with cowards who won't fight on their territory, but he also has to deal with the humiliation that comes with being underprepared. Russia wasn't ready for the invasion. Putin's arrogance led him to believe it would never happen. So Ukraine's incursion into Kursk has brought Russia's leader down to earth with a bang, again damaging his reputation both domestically and internationally. And there may be even more than 300 surrenders. On the same day that Euromaidan Press set the number at around 300, UA Wire claimed that the number could be as high as 1,000. It mentioned a new video showing Russian soldiers being loaded onto a Ukrainian Ural truck, while noting that Ukraine's military personnel didn't expect such a high number of captures. The surrenders have come so quickly, UA Wire suggests, that they're causing logistical problems for the soldiers tasked with escorting the Russian captives back to Ukraine. That's a terrible look for Putin if true. To have so many of your soldiers surrender that you catch your enemy by surprise with just how little resistance you put up makes Russia's entire military look weak. Ukraine expected a proper resistance and instead has been met with surrenders, a far cry from Russia's claims to have taken out hundreds of the invading Ukrainians already. So we see an invasion that should never have happened and the mass surrender of Russian soldiers indicating a military presence inside Russia that's nowhere near strong enough to deal with the encroaching threat. Both are massive humiliations for Putin. But perhaps the biggest humiliation comes from what Ukraine's invasion of Kursk represents: the crossing of the last major red line. Since the beginning of the Ukraine war, the concept of red lines has been prominent. These lines are actions that many in the West believed might provoke Russia into intensifying its invasion or, in the worst case, expand it to include more of Europe. Supplying Ukraine with weapons was one of these red lines, which is why the early weeks of the war saw many Western nations providing non-lethal equipment as support before it became clear that Ukraine would need more. Allowing Ukraine to use these weapons it receives from the West in Russian territory was another red line. It's also one that's been crossed multiple times in 2024, with backing from the UK, the Baltic states, and even the US. The latter of those nations, which was clearly the most hesitant to approve the use of its weapons in Russia, permitted Ukraine to use them near the Kyiv region several months ago. Red line after red line has been crossed. Yet the actual invasion of Russia appeared to be the red line that would stay in place. That's no longer the case. According to the Atlantic Council and its analysis of the Ukrainian invasion, the encroachment into Kursk represents the collapsing of the final red line that Russia had in place. Worse yet for Putin, the fact that the invasion was successful and has been met with so little resistance has made a mockery of the West's fear that an attack on Russian soil would lead to further escalation. It hasn't. Instead, all we've seen is Putin, somewhat toothlessly, claiming that Russia will repel the invaders while he decries the West for helping Ukraine. There has been no nuclear escalation. Russia hasn't even managed to put up a strong defense against the Ukrainian invasion. Instead, it appears to not know exactly how to respond as Ukrainian forces get deeper into its territory. Russian morale has been damaged. This is obvious from the sheer number of Russian soldiers that have surrendered to the Ukrainian forces. Panic is also spreading throughout Russia, made worse by the declarations of states of emergency and widespread evacuations. Add to this the emerging invasion of Belgorod, and Ukraine is creating an atmosphere in which it's clear that it'll keep pushing, leaving many in Russia to wonder if its soldiers will reach their homes. The entire dynamic of the Ukraine war has changed. And yet the crossing of this final red line showcases a pattern that's been present from the start of the war. As the Atlantic Council points out, Putin threatened a nuclear reply if Ukraine attempted to retake the occupied city of Kherson during the war's first year. "I'm not bluffing," he claimed, only to completely fail to follow up with the nuclear strikes when Ukraine retook Kherson just weeks after he made the threat. Therein lies the pattern: nuclear threats against Ukraine. Threats of retaliation against Sweden and Finland for joining NATO. Threats against the UK for allowing Ukraine to use the weapons it provides in Russia. All have been made, many times over, and yet none have been followed up. Red lines have been crossed constantly, and Putin has simply carried on his invasion with no extra action. That lack of follow-through in his threats has allowed the entire war's dynamic to change. Not only is Putin now dealing with the fact that his special military operation is taking far longer and has cost far more than he anticipated, but he now has to fight a war that involves Ukraine invading Russian territory. The momentum is now with Ukraine, as according to Sean Bell, Sky News military analyst and a former fighter pilot who told Al Jazeera that Ukraine has managed to seize the initiative as part of its invasion. He notes that the Ukrainian invasion caught everybody off guard and it forced Russia to change its tactics. Troops were withdrawn from the front line of the Donetsk region and redeployed in Kursk, apparently unsuccessfully given that Ukraine continues to advance. Ukrainian morale has been boosted, even if Russia manages to push its soldiers back. And if Ukraine manages to keep the territory it's captured, it now has a powerful bargaining chip to bring to the table in future negotiations with Russia. Perhaps Kursk could be traded for part of Donetsk or Mariupol, both regions in which Russia has taken large swathes of Ukrainian territory. In short, Russia is no longer in control over the direction the war is taking. Whether that loss of control is temporary or signals a new direction for the war is yet to be seen. But once again, Putin finds himself humiliated as the momentum shifts out of his favor and forces him into a position where he has to respond to the type of aggression he's displayed throughout the Ukraine war. Things are made even worse for Russia by the global response to the attack. In the West, there appears to be indifference, at least in terms of the possibility of the invasion leading to a response against the West. Putin again tries to blame the West, claiming on August 12th that it's clear that the West is fighting us with the hands of Ukrainians. Another threat, however veiled, has amounted to nothing. Putin hasn't responded. Ukraine's Western allies haven't amassed to tell Zelensky that he needs to withdraw his soldiers lest Russia expand the war. The West has essentially let Ukraine do whatever it feels is necessary, with the only real hint of a Western response coming from the White House. The US contacted Ukrainian military leadership to ask about the objectives of the incursion, but it certainly didn't tell Ukraine to stop. If anything, the response was more curious than worried, far from what Putin had hoped to inspire with his threats. Putin can't even rely upon China to unequivocally come to his aid. On August 12th, the Chinese Foreign Ministry called on all parties to make efforts to de-escalate the situation. They should make these efforts on what Beijing calls the 3 principles for de-escalation: no expansion of the battlefield, no escalation of fighting, and no fueling the flame. China outlined those principles just weeks after Russia first invaded Ukraine, with this later reminder being non-committal. While it comes in response to Ukraine's incursion, it could just as easily be argued that China is sending a message to Russia to de-escalate on its own end. That's far from the support Putin would have hoped to receive, and when combined with the lack of a fear response in the Western world, even more humiliation comes Putin's way. Europe is treating him like a tiger who has lost his teeth. We finish with a final question: what comes next? The latest from the Kursk invasion at the time of the writing of this script is that Ukraine is claiming to have seized 28 settlements, with its soldiers occupying about 390 square miles of Russian territory in Kursk. That's according to one of Ukraine's top military commanders, Alexander Syrsky, who provided a video brief to Zelensky that was later uploaded to the Ukrainian president's Telegram channel. "We continue to conduct an offensive operation in the Kursk region," said Syrsky. "Currently, we control about 1,000 square kilometers, equivalent to about 390 miles, of the territory of the Russian Federation. We continue to conduct are the key words here. Regardless of how Russia responds to the invasion, Ukraine has already scored a major victory, and it's going to keep pushing to claim more Russian territory. It's crossed the final red line, with no nuclear response in sight from Russia, and it's redefined the rules of engagement for the war while leaving Putin with egg on his face. Russian soldiers are surrendering en masse. Putin is making pitiful claims that the invasion is a humanitarian catastrophe while trying to divert attention away from what he's doing in Ukraine. And it finally appears that the most powerful, strong man in Russian politics has a few chinks in his armor. Chinks that could cause him serious problems, domestically and on the global stage, for many years to come. But what do you think about the Kursk invasion? Will Ukraine manage to keep funneling soldiers into Russia, enabling it to maintain the territory it's captured? Or will Russia's eventual response lead to Putin reclaiming what Russia has lost? What does the invasion mean for the future of the war? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. For 2 years, Vladimir Putin has threatened the use of nuclear weapons, and now 1,000 square kilometers of Russia are in the hands of Ukrainian forces. In one brilliant military maneuver, Ukraine has managed to expose Putin for the weak, ineffectual leader that he is, and the question the whole world is wondering is, what happened to Putin's red lines? The invasion of Kursk is the most stunning development in the Ukraine war since the Ukrainian Armed Forces, or UAF, launched its stunningly successful counteroffensive in the fall of 2022, exposing the weaknesses of the Russian military to the world. Yet Ukraine has been heavily criticized for redirecting badly needed troops and equipment from the front lines to the east to carry out the invasion of Russia, prompting many to ask if it's even worth it. Misconceptions about Russia and war itself fuels this speculation. If exposing Vladimir Putin's red lines is a sham wasn't victory enough, observers need to understand that war is not a binary choice between battles to fight. The conflict in Ukraine has pushed both nations to their limits, and the lack of a coordinated and strong military response by Russia to invasion of its territory proves what many analysts have speculated for a long time now. Russia's reserves are nearly completely out. When one would have expected the rapid deployment of reserves from the front in Ukraine to the Kursk Oblast, instead we've seen evidence of frontline units being thinned out along the less intense part of the front line in the East Ukraine, as well as a mad dash to coordinate a slapdash response to the invasion with a mix of conscripts, regular army forces, interior ministry forces, private military companies, Chechen units, National Guard, and FSB border troops. It was speculated that Russia would simply redirect large numbers of troops from its northern grouping of forces that were in May threatening an invasion of Kyiv, yet this does not seem to have been the case as of the writing of this script on August 17th. The northern grouping was planned to have a force of 75,000 to score a definitive victory in Kharkiv via a cross-border invasion from Russia, yet intelligence estimates that at most Russia only managed to put together between 20 to 50,000 troops, with the best intelligence pointing at around 35,000. This force, however, suffered significant attrition in the attempt to invade Kharkiv, with President Biden approving the use of American long-range weapons against Russian troop formations inside the Russian border. Russia, which had believed itself invulnerable inside of its own border due to Putin's constant nuclear threats and Western fears of escalation, was caught completely by surprise, and the northern grouping suffered significant casualties in a blistering long-range strike campaign involving volley after volley of artillery and HIMARS, among other weapons. The lack of a sizable response from the northern grouping to the Kursk invasion strongly indicates that the force massed for a Kharkiv invasion are no longer capable of large-scale maneuvers. Russia and Vladimir Putin's military weakness is on full display to the world, and the situation is dire. For months there have been reports of Russian units stationed along the border with NATO countries being thinned out, with soldiers and equipment redeployed to Ukraine. This runs in direct contrast with Putin's constant narrative about NATO threatening Russia militarily, yet more propaganda meant to justify his invasion of Ukraine and rile up the domestic population, while skewing public opinion among the less informed in the West. Despite Finland joining NATO and Russia technically being the most militarily vulnerable it's been in centuries, Russian units along the shared border have been constantly redeployed to Ukraine. Even in the Kaliningrad enclave, itself a perilous Russian toehold in Europe, Russian units, aircraft and missiles have been consistently retasked for service in Ukraine. It's a significant public relations failure for the West to not have made this information more public as to help fight Russian disinformation attempts and make it clear that not only did NATO never pose a military threat to Russia, but that even Russia never believed that it did. This is an incredibly important narrative to drive home in parts of the world where Russian disinformation has been most effective, the global South. From Africa to South America and even Southeast Asia, Russian propaganda narratives remain louder and more convincing than the truth, distorting global opinion on the war in Ukraine and NATO both. The Kursk invasion has significantly complicated the war in Ukraine for Russia and compounded its many weaknesses while exposing more of Putin's. Putin took 3 days to respond publicly to the invasion and did not bother to appoint a head of a military response to the invasion for over a week. This was a stunning error on his behalf, and it's allowed Ukrainian forces to run roughshod over Kursk's unorganized defenders. Putin's weakness, though, is almost certainly a reflection of Russia's weakness. The initial response to the invasion seems to have been an uncoordinated mess between regular army forces largely made up of conscripts, FSB border guards, and irregular forces such as PMCs and Chechen units. Per Ukrainian battlefield sources, the Russians lacked any coordination between the disparate groups, making them easy prey for the UAF's professional combined arms maneuver into Kursk. A common folly of dictatorships is a lack of honesty and accountability among the lower ranks, which directly impedes the flow of information to the head of state. It's likely that nobody was telling Putin the truth about the invasion because nobody wanted to be blamed for it, or speak contrary to the government narrative that it was a minor event and that the UAF were already being contained. A lack of clear joint command structure inside of the Russian government also impeded a coordinated response, and this could be either due to incompetence or by design. In the United States, authorities flow along clearly defined chains of command, unifying the disparate elements of the US armed forces and government support agencies. However, for a dictator like Putin, unified and clearly defined chains of command are a threat to his grip on power. He has learned well how many who came before him were undone by underlings holding the reins to various arms of the Russian government at once. Thus, power is kept divided and chains of command kept independent. The end result is that when crisis strikes, information does not flow freely and a response is unclear. Ukraine took full advantage of this to outmaneuver Russian forces. It's not just in Kursk, though, that we see evidence of Russia's difficulty in coordinating forces, as even inside of Ukraine amongst the branches and even different parts of each branch, Russia struggles to coordinate military maneuvers on a larger scale. The lack of reserves also highlights Putin's weakness, even as the Ukraine war shows no sign of slowing. Both nations are experiencing the same problem in this regard, with both militaries being fully committed. However, despite Russia's vastly larger industry and manpower pool, Ukraine is better positioned to be in a winning position, even if it cannot fully throw Russia out of its territory at the conclusion of hostilities. Ukraine has long delayed a wider mobilization due to its population crisis. The nation simply does not have enough young men to maintain the health of its economic future. Hence, the average age of a Ukrainian soldier is around 40 years old, but the reality of war pressures in the east has forced Kyiv's hand, and a major mobilization drive began this summer, targeting younger conscripts. There has been some pushback from Ukrainian society as war weariness settles in, but there have been no major displays against mobilization, and most draftees report for duty as instructed, even if they first seek out an exemption at draft offices. Government and military insiders predict that Ukraine will be able to hit a target of 200,000 fresh recruits by year's end, with the largest concern being training and equipping them. Here, though, Ukraine's allies have already been stepping in. The United States has so far given over 100,000 sets of body armor, with another 25,000 sets transferred early this year. NATO instructors are also helping train Ukrainian troops in training areas around Europe and the US. A new NATO program launched in July of this year includes a force of 700 NATO instructors to train Ukrainian troops on NATO equipment and basic combat skills. The training of Ukrainian fighter pilots to fly the F-16 has been accelerated, with the first combat-coded jets already flying in the skies of Ukraine, if not taking part in missions yet as of mid-August. Despite challenges, Ukrainian morale remains high, even amongst frontline troops. But these troops are exhausted, with most not having been rotated out of the front in the entire 2.5 years of fighting. The call-up of freshly mobilized personnel will help relieve this incredible pressure, and victories in Kursk have raised morale significantly both among troops and the civilian population. By comparison, the Russian situation is far worse. Mobilization in Russia is a very sensitive subject, given the nation's disastrously high-cost wars in Afghanistan and Chechnya when measured in human lives. The well-known abuse of conscripts also helps sour the Russian population to the idea of mobilization, and when Russia launched its first mobilization at the close of year 1 of the war, Russian society reacted extremely poorly despite tight media and thought controls in the nation. Putin has worked very carefully to bolster his forces without drawing public ire. While conscripts have wound up in combat roles in Ukraine, Putin has gone to great lengths to avoid it happening after an initial outcry from Russian mothers when it was discovered conscripts had taken part in the original disastrous invasion. He even went so far as to meet with a group of them and personally apologize, promising to ensure it wouldn't happen again. Despite blatant and often extreme abuse of conscripts, the social contract between the Russian government and its people are that its conscripted teenagers and young adults are not to be sent to active combat and instead fulfill support roles inside of Russia itself. Thus, Putin has focused his efforts on volunteers, or in many cases, voluntolds. There are numerous disturbing cases, including some with video evidence, of conscripts forced into signing enlistment papers at the end of their conscription period. Coerced with threats or even outright violence, conscripts have routinely wound up on the front lines, with one key difference: they were now volunteer soldiers. Russian society can tolerate a truly apocalyptic level of casualties, as long as they're seen as volunteers who fought and died by their own choice. If a conscript complains that they were forced to sign enlistment papers, the answer is typically something along the lines of "nobody can force you to do anything." These forced enlistees, though, are often quick to surrender or retreat, prompting the use of blocking forces to shoot any who refuse to take part in direct assaults. There are still a significant number of volunteers in Russia's army, though, even despite the staggering casualty rate. Extremely generous pay packages, financed by Russia's massive pre-war sovereign wealth fund, have been very appealing to many Russians, especially those living in remote regions. A single month's pay under current contracts can be as much as a full year's salary back home. Cleverly, though, Russia does not pay out a full contract up front and sends these high earners straight to the most dangerous parts of the fighting. Thus, it's rare for any of these volunteers to ever receive the full value of their contract before dying or becoming seriously injured. Recruitment efforts also show Putin's weakness. To date, the bulk of the Russian recruitment efforts have been towards rural populations and Russian minorities, as well as third-country nationals inside of Russia and around the world, lured into service with the promise of Russian citizenship upon completion. As in many places, these minorities are seen as less dead when casualty figures are tallied, because to Russian society they matter less than casualties of ethnic Russians or those from rich cosmopolitan cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow. This pool of manpower, however, is drying up, and as Russian casualties mount at incredible rates, estimated to be between 1,000 and 1,500 a day, another mobilization becomes increasingly necessary if Russia is to avoid a total defeat in Ukraine. This scares Putin deeply, though, given how unpopular the first mobilization was, especially because this next mobilization will by necessity include a significant amount of the types of Russians that Russians care about, those living in the rich cities. The fact that no major mobilization was announced after the invasion of Kursk and the continued delay in assembling a response force indicates how terrified Putin is of being forced to announce a second wave, and how increasingly weak his grip on Russian power is becoming. Yet said mobilization is seen as inevitable, and as deliveries of Western weapons ramps up and restrictions on their use loosen, casualties of young Russians will mount, threatening to destabilize Russian society. Politically, the invasion of Kursk is the most catastrophic blow to Putin's legitimacy in the entire 25-year run of his hold on Russian power. The Russian military has always suffered from significant weaknesses, but a brilliant propaganda campaign had convinced the world otherwise for decades. Putin has historically leveraged the illusion of Russian might, despite disastrous campaigns in Chechnya and Georgia, to deter his political enemies and coerce nations once belonging to the Soviet bloc. In the West, Putin has managed to wage a brilliant propaganda campaign, resulting in the world's most powerful military alliance to self-deter from providing an aid to Ukraine out of fear of Russian retaliation, a real lion being afraid of the mouse scenario. Every aid package to date has resulted in endless deliberation and careful estimation of what a Russian response might be, carefully calculated to ensure that aid won't be too provocative to the Russian Federation and risk escalating the conflict. Never mind that Putin's army can't win victory against his much smaller neighbor, and NATO is the most powerful assembly of military forces to ever exist on Earth. Yet the invasion of Kursk has shattered Putin's bluffs, and might have been in fact one of the strategic objectives of Ukraine's armed forces. There is ongoing speculation as to whether the West was aware of this invasion or not as it was being planned, and we personally believe, based off the rapid delivery of what seemed like a prepared statement from the White House, as well as a lack of the typical hand-wringing, that the West was in fact aware, or at least key allies were. There's little other explanation for why Western equipment was among the first to roll into Russia, performing the role inside of Russian territory it had originally been designed to do. Germany, which still refuses to authorize the use of its Taurus missiles against targets it deems too provocative, has had none of the expected outcry after its Marder combat vehicles were seen inside of Kursk. Given how traditionally Germany has required written permission from Vladimir Putin for each German bullet fired by a Ukrainian soldier, the lack of outcry strongly insinuates that the West was well aware of the Kursk invasion before it happened. This likely means one very specific thing, and it's likely true even if the West was unaware of the planned invasion. This invasion has wider political goals outside of the war itself. To put it very simply, Ukraine cannot win this war under the terms currently imposed on it by NATO on the use of Western weapons. The early summer Russian offensive in Kyiv showed just how close to disaster Ukrainian forces had come, and it was entirely the fault of its Western allies. Restrictions on the use of Western weapons inside of Russia allowed the nation to gather its invasion forces completely free of consequence, and historically, Russia has used the invulnerability provided by its invisible border to mass forces, launch air attacks, and stage equipment, completely safe from Ukrainian attack due to fears in the West over escalation. Thankfully, President Biden saw the danger in allowing Kyiv to fall once again and swiftly authorized the use of American weapons inside Russian territories, under strict conditions. The would-be offensive, which was predicted to completely overwhelm Ukraine's defenses, was crushed by Ukrainian long-range strikes, destroying its troop concentrations and equipment staging areas. Further attacks against Russian airfields have forced its aviation to move further from the border and even destroyed some aircraft and a lot of munitions and fuel on the ground. The end result is Russian airstrikes have slowed considerably. By invading Kursk, Ukraine has shown that Putin's red lines do not exist and emboldened its allies to act more freely. Spurred by the success in Kursk, escalation-shy Germany has seen a resurgence in support for sending even more Leopard tanks to Ukraine, and President Biden is in the final stages of authorizing the sending of cruise missiles. In just 1 week of fighting inside of Russia itself, the 2-year-long self-deterrence the West imposed on itself has completely collapsed, and now it's simply a question of politicians catching up to the new reality on the ground, a reality where Vladimir Putin is weak and his threats empty. But what do you think? Let us know in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. At the 2024 Lennart Meri Conference in Tallinn, representatives of the 3 Baltic nations delivered a chilling warning to attendees. We're getting ready to march into Ukraine. All 3, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, are ready to cross the border into Ukraine to help defend it against Russia, regardless of whether they have approval from NATO. In doing so, they would escalate tensions with Russia to near breaking point while creating a massive dilemma for NATO. Should it join the Baltic nations in more directly defending Ukraine, or sit back and wait to see how Russia responds? One thing is clear: the Baltic states see Russia's rising aggression as a major threat to their sovereignty, and that raises some key questions. What would convince the Baltics to send soldiers into Ukraine, and why would they want to do so in the first place? What are the implications for NATO? Plus, exactly how much of an impact would the militaries of these three countries have should they enter Ukraine? Let's start by digging deeper into the Baltic announcement. In May 2024, Yahoo News reported on several members of the Baltic states attending the Lennart Meri conference. There, they issued their warning to representatives from Germany, claiming that they were collectively prepared to march into Ukraine. Those threats, the outlet says, come as a result of all three nations being frustrated with Germany's approach to the use of its weapons in the Ukraine war. Namely, they're not happy that Germany has yet to permit Ukraine to use German-supplied weapons on Russian territory. The Baltic countries see the German response as half-hearted. They think it will do little to deter Russia if President Vladimir Putin and his troops know that they can focus on Ukraine without worrying about strikes on Russian territory. Worse yet, they open the door for Russia to gain significant ground in Ukraine, particularly in the eastern region of Kyiv. If that happens, those gains would represent a major threat to both the Baltic states and Poland. Cautioning restraint, as Germany is doing, could backfire, according to the Baltics. After all, it could lead to Russia finally taking Ukraine, perhaps giving Putin the springboard he needs to launch other invasions in the Baltics. However, it's important to note at this point that none of the Baltics have sent troops into Ukraine yet. They may not even do so. Militani, a Ukrainian news website focused on war in the military, suggests that the Baltics would only consider troop deployment if Russia makes significant frontline gains due to Ukraine not having sufficient Western support. In other words, the Baltics are focusing as much on their own defense as that of Ukraine. Russian success in the latter could spell bad news for the former. This is far from the only indication that the Baltics are getting ready to fight. Another Militani report, this time from May 20, 2024, notes that Estonia's Prime Minister, Kaja Kallas, has pointed out that there are troops from several countries in Ukraine already. Those soldiers provide training to Ukraine's forces. Estonia isn't one of those countries yet, with Kallas saying that such an action would require parliamentary approval. But she also says it's an open, public discussion, but I think we shouldn't rule anything out right now. In other words, Estonia sending troops into Ukraine is a possibility. There are also reports of the Baltics shoring up their border defenses to consider. In March 2024, The Conversation published an article discussing the collective decision of the defense ministers of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia to create a shared Baltic common defense zone along their borders in January. Though full details of this zone aren't available, it's believed it will contain several physical defensive structures, including bunkers. In fact, Estonia is set to begin construction on 600 of these bunkers in 2025, in addition to working alongside the other Baltic states to develop missile artillery. The country has also doubled the size of its territorial defense force to 20,000. Latvia is doubling the size of its armed forces as well, to 61,000 by 2032, and reintroduced mandatory military conscription in 2023. As for Lithuania, The Conversation says it has formed an agreement that allows it to install a permanent brigade of 4,800 soldiers on the border it shares with Russia by 2027. In short, the Baltic states are preparing for war. That's where NATO might come into play. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are all NATO members, having joined the organization in March 2004. That membership entitles them to collective defense as part of Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which states that an attack on one NATO member is considered an attack on all. As such, every other NATO country is duty-bound to jump to the defense of any of the Baltic nations if Russia attacks them. Defense is the key word here. If the Baltic countries decide to enter Ukraine on their own volition, would the rest of NATO consider any Russian strikes resulting from that decision to be grounds to fight alongside the Baltics? After all, Russia would argue that the Baltic states provoked the attacks by joining Ukraine on the battlefield, meaning they're the aggressors. Other NATO members may argue that Article 5 doesn't apply in this situation because they won't be defending the Baltic states from Russia. They would be joining it in an attack on the Russian Federation. However, the Baltics represent an important buffer zone between Russia and the rest of Europe. NATO can't allow Russia to take those three states. It would give Russia more control over the Baltic Sea, as well as important strategic positions it might use to intimidate or attack Sweden, Finland, Poland, and other nearby nations. Perhaps NATO members might find themselves in a catch-22 situation. Either they treat a Russian response to the Baltic nations as enough to trigger Article 5 of the NATO Charter, meaning they also get involved in the Ukraine war, or they sit back and wait, potentially allowing a situation in which Russia gains more territory and becomes an even greater threat to the rest of Europe. That may be the point from the Baltic perspective. Rather than waiting for NATO to act, which all three agree is an invitation to Russia to continue its aggression, they'll take the situation into their own hands. In doing so, they'll force a decision from their NATO allies: fight with us or risk losing us to the Russian Federation. It's a dangerous game, though one all three seem willing to play. The question is simple: why? Why are Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, all three of which combined likely can't defeat the Russian military, so willing to risk incurring Putin's wrath by sending their troops into Ukraine? There are several answers to this question, with one already having been discussed. The Baltic countries believe that much of the Western response to the Ukraine crisis has been underwhelming. They argue that nobody seems to be taking the true threat Russia poses, as they see it, seriously, and that Russia may target them next if they succeed in Ukraine. Better to get ahead of the issue by fighting in Ukraine than waiting for Ukraine to fall and reacting to what Russia does next. As for why the three nations believe that they're potential targets for Putin, all three will see historical parallels between themselves and Ukraine. After all, just like Ukraine, they fell under Soviet rule in the aftermath of World War II. For Latvia, that resulted in a complete loss of its independent democracy. Though the territory had spent most of its history being ruled by other countries, the Russian Revolution of 1917 opened the door for Latvia to declare its independence from Russia in 1918. 2 years later, following fighting with both Russia and Germany, the budding Soviet Union recognized Latvia as an independent country. That independence existed under a democratic structure until 1934, when President Kalāris Ulmanis established autocratic rule. Then 1939 came along, and Latvia was essentially merged into the Soviet Union, first being forced to hand over military bases to the Red Army before being fully occupied by Russia in 1940. Though the Soviets played a large part in defeating the Nazis that claimed Latvia between 1941 and 1944, that help came at a huge cost. Latvia officially became part of the Soviet Union after the war, with Russia collectivizing its farms in 1949 and integrating its economy into that of the Soviet Union. The National History Museum of Latvia notes that this early occupation, particularly the years under Joseph Stalin's regime until 1953, was marked by arrests, imprisonments, and deportations. The first year of Soviet occupation alone brought with it the deportation of about 35,000 native Latvians, most part of the country's intelligentsia, with many thousands more following in later years. Exclusion from education, constant exposure to Soviet propaganda, and the Soviet Union trying to instill its concept of planned economy in Latvia were all hallmarks of this time in the country's history. Yet a large contingent of the nation's population yearned for the days before Russia arrived, the 20 or so years in which it was independent. When the Soviet Union was finally on the brink of collapse, Latvia managed to obtain its independence once again. August 21, 1991, saw the country become a separate state. Its people have no intention of allowing today's Russia to return it to Soviet rule. Estonia and Lithuania have similar stories. For Estonia, annexation by the Soviet Union came on August 6, 1940. Thousands tried to resist, with the University of Central Arkansas stating that 1,750 Estonians were killed as a result of the country's resistance. Tragically, a further 7,450 died between August 1940 and September 1944. As seen in Latvia, the Soviet regime began mass deportations even before the end of World War II, which culminated in 10,200 Estonians being sent to Siberian labor camps. A further 35,000 Estonians were conscripted into the Soviet military between July and August 1941. Again, like Latvia, Estonia fell under the Nazi regime during the middle stages of World War II, and again, as seen in Latvia, the Soviet Union successfully fought the Nazis off. But that period of fighting led to 70,000 Estonians fleeing to Sweden and Germany, along with a further 250,000 displacements and 39,000 more deaths. Following the war, Estonia became part of the Soviet Union. Early Soviet rule forced even more devastation on the nation's people. Over 2 days in March 1949, the Soviets deported some 20,700 Estonians to Siberian labor camps, of whom 3,750 died during the journey. More imprisonments came under Stalin, with the years between 1944 and 1951 seeing 30,000 Estonians arrested under political pretenses. Some in the country tried to resist. A collective calling itself the Forest Brothers, which was 15,000 people strong, staged an insurgency in 1944. It was to no avail. Estonia, like Latvia, fell under the Soviet yoke. Estonia was a little faster to throw off the Soviet Union than Latvia. September 1988 saw around 250,000 Estonians take part in pro-independence demonstrations. 2 years later, there was a call for independence by the Estonian Supreme Council. An official declaration followed on August 20, 1991, just 1 day before Latvia gained its own independence. Then there's Lithuania. In many ways, Lithuania's history echoes that of Estonia and Latvia. Lithuania had enjoyed around 20 years of independence from Russian rule before June 1940, when the Soviet Union invaded the country. It forced Lithuania to cut all of its existing political ties. Lithuania was also subject to a secret protocol within the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of 1939. It stated that any territorial arrangement of the Baltic region would see the country's northern boundary represent the end of the Soviet influence and the beginning of Nazi territory. As with Latvia and Estonia, the first 2 years of Soviet occupation saw mass deportations. Around 35,000 native Lithuanians were forced out of the country before Germany launched an attack of its own. Again, the story mirrors that of the other Baltic states, several years of Nazi occupation before the Soviet Union regained control. A guerrilla resistance existed in the country between the mid-1940s and early 1950s. Numbering about 40,000, these forces tried to combat the Russification of Lithuania and the repression that came with it. It failed, with Russia's extensive deportations cutting huge swathes out of the resistance until Lithuania was forced to comply with the Soviet systems being imposed on it. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, the period between 1947 and 1949 alone saw 220,000 Lithuanians get deported. Many would be sent to labor camps in Siberia and elsewhere in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union enforced the collectivization of agriculture, as it had in Latvia, yet underground resistance existed. For instance, Lithuania produced more samizdat, or unsanctioned publications, than any other country in the Soviet Union in the 1970s. As with its Baltic neighbors, the desire for independence existed. That desire was realized in 1990 when elections in Lithuania resulted in a legislature that declared the country's independence. The Soviets attempted to topple the newly independent government in January 1991. That attempted coup failed, and as we saw with Estonia and Latvia, Lithuania secured full independence in August 1991. Understanding this history is key to recognizing the Baltic position. All three countries have lived under Russian repression. They fought hard for their independence, and they know that they'll likely be the next targets if Putin succeeds in Ukraine. After all, as Putin made clear during his February 2024 interview with Tucker Carlson, the restoration of territory to Russia is one of the main motivations behind his actions in Ukraine. He sees Ukraine as part of Russia based on historical context. He likely sees the Baltics in the same way. All were part of the Soviet Union between the 1940s and 1990s, and all fell under Russian control prior to the country's 1917 revolution. The Baltic nations have also had to watch Russia grow increasingly aggressive over the last 2 decades. While the special military operation in Ukraine is the most obvious example of this aggression, they won't ignore Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea. Then there's the Russo-Georgian War of 2008, which was over in just days, but marked the first war Europe saw in the 21st century. Like the Baltic states, Georgia was part of the Soviet Union. Worse yet, the response to Russia's invasion of the country from the international community was surprisingly muted, an early sign to the Baltic states that their allies weren't taking Putin's aggression seriously. They believe they can't afford to allow the rest of Europe to make the same mistake. And these aren't the only reasons why the Baltic states are considering entering Ukraine. Putin has also made direct threats to all three of them. On May 22, 2024, mere days before the Baltic nations discussed sending troops into Ukraine at the Lennart Meri conference, Politico reported on a Russian draft decree. Though that decree is now deleted, it showed a Russian proposal for the redrawing of its borders within the Baltic Sea. The proposal would essentially see Russia take control of sea territory currently overseen by Finland and Lithuania, with the latter being quick to respond that the draft represented little more than a threat. As Lithuania's foreign minister, Gabrielius Landsbergis, said to Politico, Russia's actions are seen as deliberate, targeted, escalatory provocations to intimidate neighboring countries and their societies. This is further proof that Russia's aggressive and revisionist policy is a threat to the security of neighboring countries and Europe as a whole. Perhaps that statement could be more accurately categorized as yet another wake-up call delivered to Europe from the Baltic states. Finally, there's Sweden and Finland's decision to join NATO to consider. While certainly good news for NATO as a collective, and the Baltic states in terms of their concerns about Russia, it also brought more threats from Putin. That's because Putin recognizes that Sweden and Finland being part of NATO opens up the Baltic Sea to NATO's forces. Bad news for Russia, given that it sees the Baltic Sea as strategically important to its navy. Its exclave Kaliningrad, for instance, is home to the only Russian port on the Baltic Sea that's available all year round. An increased NATO presence in that region could provoke action from Russia's president. The narrative around Sweden and Finland joining has certainly suggested that many NATO members consider their decision a victory in the Baltic region. Chatham House points out that some have even started to refer to the sea as a NATO lake. Now the collective can run more training operations and is in a better place to defend itself from Russian aggression. However, the decision also opens the door for Russia to push back, potentially leading to it taking a more aggressive stance against the Baltic states. If it does, those states argue, NATO needs to be as ready as they are to fight back. All of which brings us back to the Baltic statements about heading into Ukraine with or without NATO. If they follow through, what can they deliver to Kyiv? All three have already been massive supporters of Ukraine during the war. They each fall into the top 5 in terms of military aid provided as a percentage of gross domestic product or GDP. Latvia has provided 1.5% of its GDP, combined with bilateral donations and those made via the European Union, while Estonia and Lithuania have each provided 1.8%. They also led the way in terms of institutionalizing the aid they provide. Lithuania, for example, has pledged to offer constant support to Ukraine through 2026. The Baltic states see these contributions as being akin to their bolstering their own defenses. All are also engaged in concerted campaigns of de-Russification. Latvia has adopted a new law that will see Russian language teaching phased out of public education by 2025. In July 2023, Lithuania stripped residency permits from 135 Russians living in the country, all of whom it deemed security threats. Estonia has taken similar action, in addition to barring Russians from crossing its border soon after the Ukraine war began. The message is clear from all three. They not only oppose the war, but are actively trying to rid themselves of the Russian influences that remain following the Soviet Union's collapse. As for the direct military assistance each could provide, it's important to note that none of the Baltic states are considered particularly strong, especially when compared to Russia. In Global Firepower's 2024 ratings of 145 military nations, all land in the bottom half of the list. Estonia's position of 87 out of the 145 is the best the Baltics can muster. But that doesn't mean they would not be useful in the fighting. Starting with Latvia, the lowest ranked of the three at 99, the country has 65,750 military personnel, of whom 17,250 are part of its active military. The rest make up its reserves, along with 12,500 that are part of paramilitary groups. Unfortunately for Ukraine, Latvia has no tanks, though it maintains a stock of 1,544 vehicles. It could also bring 59 units of self-propelled artillery into Ukraine, as well as lean on its 6 mine warfare vessels to cause issues in the Baltic Sea. An underwhelming force perhaps, especially when considering who Latvia will be fighting, but that small army will be propped up by Lithuania and Estonia. GFP says that Lithuania could bring more military personnel into Ukraine as it has 141,150 in total. Granted, only 23,000 of those people are part of its active military. However, it has 104,000 reservists upon whom it could call, along with 14,150 paramilitary troops. Like Latvia, it has no tanks to offer, though it can bring about 1,300 vehicles to the fight. Add to that its self-propelled artillery and towed artillery, 21 and 54 units respectively, and you have a decent amount of ground warfare equipment. Like Latvia, Lithuania's navy is small, consisting of just 11 assets. However, 4 of those are mine warfare ships, creating the potential for it to team up with Latvia to make the Baltic Sea a more dangerous place for Russian ships. Lithuania would also be able to bring a handful of helicopters and fixed transports to the fight. Finally, there's Estonia. The most powerful of the three according to GFP's rankings. Estonia has 96,500 military personnel, of whom 7,700 are active. It brings 6 units of rocket artillery to the conflict, along with 24 self-propelled artillery units. Plus, it could add another 1,409 vehicles to Ukraine's forces. A handful of helicopters and fixed-wing transports would also prove useful, as might Estonia's small navy. It could add 4 more mine warfare ships to the Baltic Sea. These stats show that none of the Baltic nations are powerhouses, but perhaps that isn't the point. The three states will feel a certain kinship with Ukraine, having all previously fallen under Soviet rule themselves. They'll also see Putin making threats against them and likely consider themselves the next target should Ukraine fall. For that reason, they'd enter the conflict with motivation, not only to help Ukraine but to defend themselves. They could potentially stretch the war's front lines to include their borders, spreading Russia's troops thin in the process, and use their navies to force Russia to expend resources in the Baltic Sea. Then there's the NATO question. Would the Baltic states entering Ukraine serve as a signal to NATO, and particularly the organization's European states, that it has to get involved? Maybe that's what the Baltic states hope for. All three will know that their militaries aren't powerful enough to cause major problems for Russia without support from the West. By entering Ukraine, they may seek to show just how fragile the Baltic buffer between Russia and Europe is, forcing NATO to respond to prevent Russia from taking their territory. If so, it's a risky gambit. Only time will tell if the Baltic nations follow through on their proclamations that they'll enter the Ukraine war if Russia takes more ground. With that, we conclude today's video. Let us know what impact you think Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia could have on the Ukraine war if they joined. Would they manage to force NATO's hand, or would the rest of Europe sit back and wait to see how it all pans out? Share your opinions in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out how war in Ukraine is de-Russifying the Baltic states, or click this other video instead. Russia's invasion of Ukraine failed to produce the quick victory that Vladimir Putin and indeed the wider world expected. Kyiv did not fall in days, as everyone assumed. The Ukrainian government survived, but this should not be as surprising as it once seemed. The mistake of assuming a rapid, decisive victory is one that military leaders and warring states have made since ancient times. Sun Tzu cautioned leaders who thought of uncomplicated victories that the worst policy of all is to besiege walled cities, and that there is no instance of a country having benefited from prolonged warfare. Putin, like so many wannabe conquerors before him, failed to heed these warnings, and by March 2022 found himself in a prolonged war of attrition. No single decisive battle would end this war. Exhaustion from equipment losses and casualties would. It's now been over 2 years since the invasion began, and both sides have suffered from the latest instance of protracted warfare. But how many casualties have both sides taken since February 24, 2022? And how do these casualty figures tie into the ability of each of the warring countries to carry on the hostilities and walk away with a victory? First, it's helpful to remember that casualties do not equal people being killed in action. Casualties not only include those killed, but also wounded, captured, or missing. In 2021, Ukraine's population was about 44 million people. Russia's 2021 population was about 143.4 million, a figure 3.2 times as large. According to the Global Firepower Index, as of 2024, Ukraine has an available manpower of about 22 million, with 15.4 million fit for service and 476,000 reaching military age annually. Russia has 69.4 million, 46.4 million, and 1.2 million in each respective category. 2 years of war in Ukraine have produced hundreds of thousands of casualties in a combined total, but trying to determine more specific figures than that is a little trickier. For understandable reasons, both sides are reluctant to release their data. Looking at the size of the respective armies is a good way to start. Before Russia invaded, Ukraine had about 300,000 personnel between its regular armed forces and paramilitary troops. The war has swelled Ukraine's forces to about 2.2 million today, with an active duty force of 900,000. The rest are reserves and paramilitary forces, and not all of them are deployed at once. Russia, meanwhile, began the invasion with 190,000 troops. This was obviously not enough. By May 2023, after the partial mobilizations began, the number went up to 300,000, according to EU sources. By September, Russian forces in Ukraine had increased to 420,000, according to sources in Ukrainian intelligence. Russia's armed forces number 1.32 million active personnel, 2 million in reserve, and 250,000 paramilitary troops. Not all of these are deployed in Ukraine, as some of them need to patrol Russia's long borders, but more of the country's available troops have steadily been drawn in as the conflict continues. How many of these troops have become casualties? By June 2022, Ukraine reported that 10,000 of its men had been killed and an additional 30,000 injured. Russian losses were reported to be about 3 times that number. Accounting for overestimates, this is at least a reasonable idea because Ukraine was on the defensive as Russia attempted to sweep through the Donbas region. In September, Russia released figures supposedly showing that Ukraine had suffered 61,000 deaths and about 49,000 wounded, in comparison to about 50,000 Russian wounded and 10 times fewer casualties. These figures were plainly absurd, especially with Russian troops routing as Ukraine regained thousands of square kilometers of territory. 2023 brought more concrete, independent data. In August, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America, PNAS, used 4,609 reports of military and civilian losses encompassing both sides and developed a statistical model to come up with a reasonably accurate estimate of each country's respective casualties. The authors tried to account for reporting biases on both sides. In particular, the study found that both sides overestimated the losses suffered by their respective opponents. Ukraine, they said, tends to magnify Russian deaths to twice what they actually are, while Russia estimated that Ukraine suffered 4 times as many fatalities as it actually did. PNAS also said that Russian sources underestimated their own casualty figures. The authors noted that Russia has suffered both more total casualties and a greater proportion of fatalities within its casualties, and Russian sources typically only report a third of the deaths their armed forces actually suffer. PNAS estimated that by February 2024, Ukraine had suffered about 17,200 fatalities and about 33,000 injuries. At this point, Russia was taking tens of thousands casualties in the months-long battle for Bakhmut. That same month, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu claimed that his forces had suffered 11,000 casualties in the battle, but Western officials said that between 20,000 and 30,000 Russian troops had become casualties there. These figures did not include the mercenaries from the then-active Wagner Group, which also suffered terrible losses in the battle, enough for it to rise in revolt against Moscow shortly after the city fell. Ukraine's garrison at Bakhmut had inflicted highly disproportionate casualties. But all was not well for Ukraine. As the Battle of Bakhmut raged, Ukraine was preparing for its counter-offensive in Zaporizhia. Western observers had high hopes for this operation and hoped that it would reach the Sea of Azov, cutting Russia's land bridge to Crimea. Unfortunately, Ukraine was unable to even come close to repeating the successes of 2022. The Ukrainian military wound up cracking the first two of Russia's three extensive defensive lines of Zaporizhia, but were unable to translate this momentum into a wider breakthrough. As Ukrainian forces flung themselves on the most elaborate network of fortifications seen in Europe since World War I, casualties naturally mounted. By August 2023, as the campaign in Zaporizhia raged, American sources estimated that Ukraine's casualties ballooned to a number between 100,000 and 120,000 injuries and 70,000 dead. Curiously though, Russia is regarded as having taken more casualties in this campaign than Ukraine, despite being on the defensive. In September, the Institute for the Study of War noted that Russia's Storm Z detachments with convict recruits had arrived to act as cover for units in the regular army, such as the airborne forces. With these troops being treated as cannon fodder, Russia was suffering hundreds of casualties per day, even as the Ukrainian offensive was failing to make strategic gains. With costly human wave tactics harkening back to many past wars, it should not be surprising that Russia has suffered far more fatalities than it officially reports. In June 2022, Russian sources claimed that they had suffered about 5,900 fatalities since the war began, but British intelligence sources estimated it to be nearly 3 times that, at roughly 15,000, and Ukrainian sources claimed it was over 30. Given the biases that PNAS mentioned, the British figure is likely the most trustworthy for that point in the war. By February 2023, PNAS's estimate for Russian casualties was roughly 150,000 injuries and almost 70,000 fatalities. In August, after the Russians had captured Bakhmut at an enormous cost and were suffering during Ukraine's Zaporizhia campaign, American intelligence sources estimated that Russia had suffered 120,000 fatalities during the course of the war, with an additional 170,000 to 180,000 injured. This would seem like a high proportion of deaths compared to the total casualties, and given their source, may be less than trustworthy compared to another figure released 2 months later. An independent investigation by the BBC and Media Zona, an anti-Putin Russian news outlet, used data from Russian cemeteries to conduct a statistical analysis. Through this study, they estimated that Russia had suffered at least 88,000 fatalities since the war started. A month later, a Ukrainian army official claimed on Facebook that Russia had suffered 170,000 injuries and over 150,000 deaths. The BBC Media Zona study is likely the closest to the truth. By March 2024, the British Ministry of Defense claimed that Russia had suffered 355,000 total casualties in the 2 years' war, amounting to about 983 per day. 2 months earlier, British officials predicted that Russia would suffer over 500,000 total casualties by the end of 2024. But these are military casualties only. Civilians have typically suffered the worst in war. Has it been the same this time? Russia has ignored the international humanitarian treaties that it's signed onto and attacked Ukrainian civilian population centers. Civilians in Russian-occupied areas have suffered even worse. In September 2022, UN sources estimated that there were 18,500 civilian injuries and 10,000 deaths in Ukraine. This would be a low ratio of civilian to military losses in historical wars. The UN said that the true figures could be much higher due to verification issues. Many of these casualties came during the siege of Mariupol that lasted between February and May 2022. Ukrainian sources claim that 25,000 civilians died there, although they would have wanted to magnify this number as part of the information warfare environment against Russia. UN sources confirmed 1,350 such deaths, but naturally estimated the number to be significantly higher. In January 2022, the city had a population of about 425,600 people. By May 2023, it had dropped to about 120,000, with the Institute for the Study of War citing Russian documentary evidence that plans were in place to ethnically cleanse the Ukrainian people there and replace them with Russians. UN sources claimed that 500 civilian deaths and 1,047 injuries were of children. Given that Russia has been known to attack at least one school in Kyiv with cluster bombs, an unambiguous war crime that resulted in the death of a child, this is likely an undercount. Cluster bombs often fail to detonate, with Russian bombs in particular having dud rates as high as 40%. These unexploded bombs in effect become landmines. This is why it should not be surprising that at least 303 of those civilian deaths and 676 injuries came from mines and abandoned explosives. Ukraine has since become the most heavily mined country in the world, and more civilians have undoubtedly been accidentally killed by these. The February 2023 PNAS study claimed that 13,000 Ukrainian civilians had died and about 19,000 had been injured. In February 2024, the UN released a new estimate, verifying 30,457 civilian casualties, with close to 11,000 killed and 20,000 injured. In a total war of attrition, inflicting civilian casualties helps to cripple the enemy economy by depriving it of labor and productive capacity. This was the case during World War II, and like in so many other ways, the Russian military seems to be taking this approach to the treatment of civilians in Ukraine, despite international humanitarian law. Since the war has mostly been fought on Ukrainian territory, Russia has suffered few civilian casualties. However, it's not escaped unscathed. Cross-border raids, such as the one in Belgorod in May 2023, and missile drone strikes have left their marks. By August 2023, 7x7, another Russian independent media source, estimated that there had been 105 civilian casualties. These were concentrated near the border with Ukraine. While wounded men can sometimes return to action, this is often not the case. By December 2023, at least 20,000 of Ukraine's wounded had required amputations, and according to a Russian source, that was perhaps being unusually honest. Over half of all the wounded Russian soldiers required amputation. Tens of thousands of troops are also suffering from mental health issues. Lack of adequate rotation, especially in the Russian lines, has led to a full-blown mental health crisis. Abuse of alcohol and other drugs is common. Although the reports vary, the conclusion seems inescapable that Russia has not only suffered more casualties than Ukraine, but at a disproportionate rate. However, because Russia has a significantly larger population, it can still more easily afford its casualties than Ukraine, since they are far more easily replaceable. There are additional problems for Ukraine in mobilizing its people to fight this war. Much of the population has become refugees since the invasion started. 8 million Ukrainians have been internally displaced between February and May 2022. An additional 8 million fled the country by the war's first anniversary. That amounts to 37% of the country's pre-war population. Although most of these refugees have been women and children who are either unfit for military service or are not fit for all tasks, experts estimate that at least 20,000 Ukrainian men fled to avoid being drafted. The situation seemed to improve for Ukraine by the end of 2022, as some of the refugees returned home, with the figures dropping down to 5.1 million internally displaced persons and 6.3 million Ukrainian refugees living abroad. Ukraine's successful counteroffensives drew some people back. However, the war has turned against Ukraine since then. There is a darker side to this population flow. About 1 million Ukrainian nationals have forcibly been deported to Russia. The Fourth Geneva Convention, which Russia has ratified, prohibits this, and so this practice is considered a war crime. The International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for some Russian officials, including Vladimir Putin, for this behavior. However, Ukraine is not the only one suffering a loss of available manpower through refugees. Russia has also suffered, and disproportionately, in the prime military demographic. When Vladimir Putin announced his partial mobilization in the autumn of 2022, hundreds of thousands of men left the country to avoid conscription. These people are often some of Russia's best and brightest, who contribute disproportionately to its economy. Between 800,000 and 900,000 total people have fled Russia since the start of the war. At least 250,000 men are among those refugees. These are all people that cannot be called on to do any military service, and their no longer being available is important for Ukraine, as it amounts to Russia essentially losing a year's worth of replacements for its soldiers. This is crucial if it wants to win the war of attrition. Nevertheless, Ukraine is suffering a much worse shortage of manpower, which is why the country's draft laws have been changed. In April 2024, the Ukrainian parliament passed a new law that made more people eligible for conscription. Ordinarily, Ukrainian men over the age of 27 had been subject to conscription upon the declaration of martial law. The legislature has since lowered the age to 25, but the law went further than broadening the draft pool. Ukraine's brass had complained that not enough troops are showing up to camp. Draft dodging has become common. As in most wars of this nature, the initial swell of patriotism has since given in to gloom as the cost of the conflict has revealed itself. Troops are no longer so eager to fight. To crack down on draft dodging, the new law requires men to update their conscription data with the authorities within 60 days. Draft dodging now also comes with stricter penalties. A proposal to insert time limits for mobilization was dropped, and military service remains open-ended. However, there are also new incentives. Volunteers now get more pay. The Ukrainian parliament has also loosened recruitment rules in another way. In a sign of the increasing pressure Ukraine is under, the new law takes a page out of Russia's playbook and permits convicts to join the army under some conditions. Women are still not required to serve, but earlier legislation expanded the number of professions in which they were mandated to register. Previously, only women serving in specialized roles such as medicine were required to register for military service. Now women in professions as varied as journalism and music can be mobilized if wartime conditions demand it. So far, women have not been forcibly mobilized, but as pressure mounts, that could change. These new measures inspired fierce opposition among the war-weary Ukrainian public, but casualties in the 2 years of fighting have taken their toll, and the military needs replacements. Ukraine's brass, such as General Yuri Sodol, who commands the forces in Kyiv, Donetsk, and Luhansk oblasts, lamented that he lacked manpower, with the Russian invaders outnumbering his troops by 7 to 10 times. This is not a winning formula in a war of attrition, even as Ukraine continues to inflict disproportionate casualties on Russian troops. Acknowledging that attrition, and not a decisive battle, would be key to winning this war, the Estonian Ministry of Defense claimed in December 2023 that Russia would need to kill or maim at least an additional 100,000 troops in 2024 in order for victory to be possible. The Estonians warned, if undisrupted, Russia has the capacity to train approximately 130,000 troops every 6 months into cohered units and formations available for launching operations. This would lead to 260,000 new troops available per year, which in turn can sustain a total force of 420,000 troops in Ukraine. The Estonians said that Ukraine must increase the demand for Russian manpower to the point that Moscow cuts corners with its basic training and sends increasingly worthless replacements to the battlefield. These troops will die faster, leading to a feedback loop of Russia becoming increasingly desperate for manpower as the war spirals into an unsustainable cycle. To do this effectively, Ukraine must also mitigate its losses. The Estonians estimated that Ukraine suffered a total of 200,000 casualties just shy of the war's second anniversary. They recommended that Ukraine's Western allies help it to mitigate these casualties by providing better training to Ukrainian recruits. Over 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been trained by its Western allies. However, the Estonians reported that this training was not to the same quality. For example, basic training in the US Army is 10 weeks, followed by months of additional training for specialized tasks. Ukrainian troops have only gotten 5 weeks in basic and presumably far less for specialized tasks. It's time for us to set new objectives, a new pace, a new standard of quality in training, the Estonians concluded. This strategy of increasing Ukraine's lethality while training its soldiers to higher standards will require time though, time that Russia believes it has on its side. Ukraine has suffered severe shortages of ammunition in the first half of 2024 as Western aid slowed down. Aid picked up in the spring, with millions of shells and other vital ammunition set to arrive this summer. These packages should take Ukraine at least into 2025. Ukraine already killed or maimed well over 100,000 Russian troops in the first 2 years of the war. With such tools on hand, it's in a good position to meet the benchmark the Estonians have set for it, but difficulties have been multiplying. The British general Sir Richard Barrons warned in an interview with the BBC that a major Russian offensive looked to be coming this summer, which he thinks will be in Donbass and potentially toward Kyiv. In April, General Christopher Cavoli, the senior American commander in Europe, warned that Ukraine would need significantly more aid and ammunition. Such aid is now arriving, and with stubborn Russian human wave tactics, the new shells, missiles, and later in the year F-16s should give Ukraine the means to inflict the 100,000 deaths and permanent injuries the Estonians believe will be necessary. Only time will tell if the war takes a turn for the better, and Ukraine can use its new weapons to inflict the casualties it supposedly needs to. But one thing about the casualties in the fighting is clear. War may be a highly emotional matter, inspiring works of art and the consciousness of nations for thousands of years, but to the generals, it's often only a matter of math. What do the casualties in Ukraine reveal about the state of the war and the prospect for both sides? Will Ukraine be able to inflict the necessary casualties on Russia as its so-called shell hunger ends this summer? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to like this video and support the channel and hit the subscribe button for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out Putin's huge tank losses, or click this other video instead. Putin is done. Those are the words uttered by Peter Zeihan during a June 2024 interview with the Times Radio. Zeihan is an expert on geopolitics who has worked with Fortune 500 firms. The author of several books including The End of the World is Just Beginning and Disunited Nations, Zeihan made this claim in a reference to the future of both Putin and Russia's army. At various points during the interview, Zeihan argues that Putin is slowly losing his grip on power and that Ukraine is well positioned to launch a counter-offensive in the summer of 2024. That brings us to today's video. We're going to explore Zeihan's reasoning for his claims and highlight some of the issues that could lead to Putin ultimately losing the war in Ukraine. So is Putin really done? Zeihan's justifications for that claim start with the arrival of Patriot weapon systems and Western fighter jets in Ukraine. Starting with the Patriot systems, the Times Radio interviewer noted that the US had just announced that it would send another of those systems at a cost of $1.1 billion to Ukraine, adding that it's something that Ukraine badly needs. Each of these systems is capable of firing a 17-foot missile, with said munitions being equipped with a track-via missile targeting system that enables mid-course corrections while it's en route to its target. The missile can fly for 43 miles, reaching a maximum altitude of around 15 miles, and comes packed with a 198-pound warhead. They're extremely powerful weapons. Their manufacturer, RTX, says that Patriot missiles can intercept ballistic and cruise missiles, as well as take out drones and other advanced aerial threats. And it's this, Zeihan claims, that makes the delivery of more of them such a vital win for Ukraine. He says that it's important for people to think of what these Patriot systems can offer Ukraine over the next several months, as opposed to considering what has been happening during the early stages of 2024. The Ukrainians needed more air defense, claims Zeihan, and the Russians were taking advantage of a lull in weapons deliveries to basically hit the Ukrainians with all kinds of air-based weapon systems. With more Patriots, Ukraine can shore up its aerial defenses. They alone won't be enough, however, as Patriot missile systems can only cover a limited, albeit somewhat broad, area, even though they have a long firing range. Where they really become important in terms of Putin losing his grip on the territory Russia has claimed in Ukraine, says Zeihan, is where they're used in combination with the Western fighter jets that are on their way to the country. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, NATO member nations have committed to sending at least 65 F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. These jets, which are anticipated to enter service toward the end of 2024, won't be enough to grant Ukraine total air superiority over its own territory. They're too few in number, and even though Russia's aerial offensives have faltered, could be overwhelmed with sheer numbers. Instead, these jets, along with a shipment of several Mirage 2000 jets from France, would allow Ukraine to create brief pockets of aerial superiority. Those pockets could make a massive difference, according to Zeihan, who says that creating them massively increases the capacity of the Ukrainian military to launch strikes. Every offensive the Ukrainians have attempted for the last 12 months has bogged down because they don't have air superiority, Zeihan says. That will change through a combination of Patriot missile systems and the arrival of Western fighter jets. For the first time since the war began, Ukraine will be able to conduct offensives with aerial support. That means ground troops will be able to move quickly and in large numbers because they face fewer threats from Russia's artillery. For example, Ukraine could use Patriot missiles to disable aerial threats while relying on its F-16s to take out the artillery that typically peppers Ukrainian troops as they attempt to advance. This approach would not require Ukraine to establish total aerial dominance. Instead, it would create pockets of superiority, allowing for troop movements and offensives that can retake positions Russia has claimed. Ukraine will have more time to do things like clear mines on the battlefield and prepare for its attacks. Those attacks will also be more coordinated because they're not starting in conditions where Ukrainian troops are simply trying to survive artillery barrages. The stage could thus be set for counteroffensives that retake Ukrainian territory. In short, Russia starts to lose territory thanks to Ukraine's stronger aerial threat. Of course, there's an obvious counterpoint to Zeihan's argument here. What's to stop Russia from using its own anti-air defenses to prevent Ukraine from achieving these pockets of aerial superiority? The answer lies in the S-400 Triumph Surface-to-Air, or SAM, missile system. Designed by Russia and entering service in 2007, the S-400 is supposed to be somewhat equivalent to America's Patriot missile systems. Missile Threat says that it's capable of shooting down cruise missiles, unmanned aerial vehicles, and aircraft, which should make it perfect for deploying against Ukraine's incoming F-16s. It's powerful too. Each S-400 missile can travel up to 248 miles and can carry a warhead weighing up to 315 pounds. Looking at the specifications alone, the S-400 is more powerful and rangier than Ukraine's Patriot missile systems, meaning that it should be more than capable enough of taking out F-16s and incoming missiles. But there's a problem. Russia has deployed S-400 systems frequently during the Ukraine war, and unfortunately for Putin, they've proven far less effective than Russia had anticipated. In September 2023, Newsweek reported that Ukraine was increasingly cutting away at Russia's supply of S-400s. The outlet reports that Russia had 96 of these SAM systems available at the beginning of 2023, with reports suggesting those numbers were being whittled down by the month. Quoting the Dutch open-source intelligence agency Oryx, Newsweek says that Russia had lost key components of at least 5 of its S-400 batteries in Crimea by September 2023. The situation has only gotten worse for Russia as the war moved into 2024. Writing for Forbes in June of that year, military commentator David Axe noted that a mid-May barrage of 10 Army tactical missile system rockets struck a base in Belbek within occupied Crimea. Each of these rockets weighed 2 tons and exploded to release hundreds of grenade-sized bomblets, creating a cluster bomb effect that devastated the Russian base. Among the equipment damaged there were 4 warplanes, along with a pair of S-400 launchers and a radar system. Russia replaced the S-400s. Ukraine bombed them again. This time, Ukraine took out 2 more S-400s, as well as one of Russia's older S-300 SAM systems. In short, Axe said, Ukraine is now in a position where it can take out Russia's S-400s as quickly as Russia can replace them in occupied Crimea. All of that brings us back to Zihan's claims that Putin is losing his grip on power. Russia is soon going to face a Ukraine that can not only establish limited pockets of aerial superiority, but can also take out the very anti-air defenses Russia relies upon to prevent that superiority from happening. Worse yet, the destruction of so many S-400s leaves Putin with egg on his face, as what's supposed to be the most advanced SAM unit in the world has proven to be extremely vulnerable to Ukrainian weapons. That's not just a problem for Putin in terms of his attempts to project Russian power. Incidents like these are also reducing the interest that other countries have in Russian weapons. Zihan highlights India as one of these nations, noting that the loss of so many S-400s is showing that Russia's weapons aren't as capable as advertised to the nations that were buying them. In India's case, Politico noted in April 2024 that Russia would practically lose all of its customers from India in the coming months. The war in Ukraine has exposed the fabled prowess of Russian weaponry as a myth, the report claims. In truth, India's imports of Russian weapons have been declining before the Ukraine war. Between 2009 and 19, 76% of India's weapon imports came from Russia. That number has dropped to just 36% during the last 5 years, with Politico noting that it's likely to fall to 0 very soon. Given that India has earmarked $100 billion for future weapon procurement, Putin faces a doubly bad situation when it comes to selling his weapons. Russia's biggest customer is jumping ship, costing the country a huge slice of that $100 billion, and it's likely going to spend the bulk of that money on Western weapons instead. Russia is weakened and the West is empowered. That's the opposite of what Putin hopes to achieve with the Ukraine war, which was intended to be a projection of Russian power and a demonstration of the country's ability to easily win a war. Instead, Russia has been bogged down in a war of attrition that's seen it lose an aura of invulnerability that Putin has spent the last 2 decades cultivating. With that loss of the aura, Zihan suggests, may come the loss of Putin's hold over Russia. It gets even worse for Putin. Combine the loss of so many S-400 SAMs with the destruction of around 1/3 of Russia's dreaded Black Sea fleet, and you have a situation in which Russia could conceivably lose Crimea. The region, which was controlled by Ukraine until Russia annexed it in 2014, is at risk of becoming a non-factor in the war due to Ukraine's tactics. Could it be just literally a matter of time until Ukraine can shut down Russia in Crimea, cutting it off and stopping Russia's ability to support the war from there? Zihan asks during the interview. Answering himself, he claims that that is definitely the goal for Ukraine. However, even if Ukraine isn't able to liberate Crimea, Zihan notes, it's in a strong tactical position to at least damage it extensively. That would cause major problems for Russia on the logistical front, given that Crimea is one of the country's main routes into Ukraine. Zihan points out that Russia has 2 routes in and out of Crimea, a rail route that tracks through Mariupol and the Kerch Bridge. Both are vulnerable to Ukrainian strikes, with the latter having already been targeted. In April 2024, The Guardian reported that Ukraine had already conducted 2 drone strikes on the bridge, with a third likely being considered for some point in 2024. Zihan agrees that the bridge will likely be a target, noting that Ukraine could probably target and destroy it right now, but is likely waiting until it receives more military capacity. Why does this matter in the context of Putin's grip on power? When you do that, Crimea goes from being a launch pad for Russian assaults to simply the most vulnerable part of the Russian landmass, claims Zihan. The loss of Crimea, or merely the loss of the ability to use it to keep troops supplied on the Ukrainian mainland, would be a huge blow to Putin. Strategically, Russia's army would weaken due to the logistical problems Ukrainian strikes would create. With no bridges and destroyed rail routes, Russia would be forced to use its Black Sea fleet to ship supplies into Ukraine. A third of that fleet has already been destroyed. And thanks to Turkey's control over the Turkish Straits, which leads into the Black Sea, Russia is unable to replenish the Black Sea fleet with new ships. Putin would face a logistical disaster, and one that would only get worse as time went on and Ukraine destroyed more of the Black Sea fleet. Then there's the symbolic aspect of taking Crimea. If Ukraine is able to not only destroy logistical routes, but enter Crimea and retake it from Russia, Putin would experience a massive shot to his power projection. He will lose what he considers Russian territory, again seeing the aura of invulnerability that surrounded both him and Russia getting chipped away. Still, the taking of Crimea is far from an inevitability, and may not even be possible, unless Ukraine receives even more weapons. Even so, Putin is still in a position where Ukraine can damage Crimea, destroy Russia's logistical solutions, and take out ships and weapons that Putin believed would be effective in the war. Putin's grip on power loosens further. That brings us to another problem that Putin faces: Western nations allowing Ukraine to use weapons they supply inside Russia. Several have done so already, with the UK essentially claiming that Ukraine can use the missiles it supplies in whatever way they see fit, while Germany and the US have also given their seal of approval. In the case of the latter, that approval is conditional. Ukraine can only use American weapons in the Kyiv region to strike Russia directly behind the border to prevent strikes in Kyiv itself. The US has also taken things a step further. In June 2024, it lifted a decade-long ban on the Azov Brigade, which had barred the transfer of weaponry and the use of US-supplied training to the group. This was a controversial step. The ban was in place because the Azov Brigade has neo-Nazi origins, which Russia has taken full advantage of in its propaganda by claiming that the US is now flirting with Nazis to get what it wants. America thinks differently. It says the Azov Brigade has passed a series of stringent tests based on the Leahy vetting process, finding that there is no evidence of gross violations of human rights committed by the 12th Brigade Azov. What does this mean for Russia and Ukraine? Ukraine gets a huge boost, and the Azov Brigade is one of the most battle-hardened units and will offer advantages on the battlefield. As for Russia, the approval showcases that Western nations, particularly the US, are becoming less escalation-phobic as the war drags on. Zihan claims that these moves represent the US becoming even more willing to cross red lines in how it's dealing with Russia. Red line is a term used by the Russian Federation to refer to any geopolitical action that it believes could damage the country's position. The use of Western or NATO-provided weaponry within Russia is one of those red lines. So far, Zihan claims, the West has crossed 34 of these lines, with the use of Western military technology being the most recent. Why does crossing these red lines matter to Putin? The simple answer is that every instance of crossing a red line has been met with threats of retaliation by Russia. However, none of those threats have been realized. Zihan says that it's likely that Russia's red line threats were intended to slow down Western involvement, giving it more time to damage Ukraine, so the increasing crossing of them now represents the West taking a more aggressive approach to Russia. So Putin now faces a twofold problem that could weaken his grip on power. With Western approval, Ukraine has already started striking targets within Russia. Zihan brings up Ukraine's targeting of a radar system nestled a couple of hundred miles within Russia that was designed to help with ballistic missile defense. Those types of strategic assets are now on the table for Ukraine, meaning it can not only chip away at the Russian war machine within its territory, but also take out supporting equipment inside Russia. The result is the opening up of more opportunities for Ukrainian counteroffensives due to the weakening of Russia's military. Secondly, and perhaps far more worryingly for Putin, the West's willingness to allow Ukraine to use its weapons suggests that the West no longer takes him seriously. At least not so seriously that it believes his threats of imminent retaliation for crossing a red line. This doesn't mean that the West believes war with Russia isn't possible in the future. Even as far back as January 2024, NATO officials were claiming that the organization needed to be ready for war. That month saw NATO Military Committee Chief Rob Bauer claim, "We have to realize it's not a given that we are in peace, and that's why we are preparing for a conflict with Russia." So the problem for Putin isn't that the West flat out doesn't believe he might retaliate. is that the West is getting ready to fight back, meaning Putin's constant attempts to project power are failing. And that brings us to another of Zihan's justifications for his opinion that Putin is losing his grip on power. The Russian political system is built around the concept of a strongman. Russian politics are quirky, claims Zihan. It's a strongman system, and it's always been a strongman system. Putin specifically rules through the intelligence service, which is a combination of the rule of terror and the rule of infiltration. While that form of rule is fairly stable in the sense that it allows Putin to generally get what he wants done, it's also fairly brittle. One big change could topple the whole thing. Zihan points to several examples throughout Russian history, noting that the year before every coup or revolution the country has seen provided little cause for alarm for those in charge. But there was always a trigger event. The loss of the Crimean War damaged the Tsars, for instance. Their system collapsed following the loss in the October Revolution, according to Zihan. The Cuban Missile Crisis offers another example. It precipitated the fall of Nikita Khrushchev. In other words, a Russian realization that it has lost, and lost big, is often a trigger for a complete change in the country's leadership. The people stop buying into the propaganda, and the strongman at the top weakens to the point that he falls. That major loss hasn't come for Russia in the Ukraine war, says Zihan. However, there are signs that Putin is starting to lose the propaganda battle. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs highlighted this in May 2024, when a survey it conducted found that 72% of young adult Russians don't trust any media outlet in the country to publish unbiased and factual information. Even more worrying for Putin, 24% of those younger Russians are more likely to trust the information they get from social media, almost matching the 25% who say they trust state-owned newspapers. The message here is that many younger Russians are veering away from relying on state-owned news sources, another massive chip taken away from Putin's strongman image. The potential fall of Crimea is the only thing on the short-term horizon that could serve as the one big event that topples Putin. But even that might not be enough, at least when taken alone. Zihan posts a worrying potential example of what he means, noting that Ukraine may be able to advance to the Crimean coast. Doing that while cutting off all means of supply to the region by taking out rail lines and the bridges between Crimea and the Ukrainian mainland could allow Ukraine to turn Crimea into what Zihan dubs a death camp. The camp would be run by Russian leadership already stationed in Crimea, Zihan claims, and would see Russian people living in Crimea start to starve and die. Zihan notes that Russia already destroyed the Kakhovka Dam, meaning there's no more irrigation in Crimea for agriculture. Its food is imported, which means Ukraine blockading Crimea from the coast and destroying its logistical systems would be devastating, making the rest of the world, including Russia, aware that Russians are dying in the streets of Crimea, which is under Russian rule, could be more effective than taking the territory back. It could also be a big enough incident to finally topple Putin as the strongman leader. Speaking of people dying, the conversation later turns to the sheer scale of deaths Russia has experienced during the Ukraine war. Times Radio notes the number of Russians who died in the 10-month battle for Bakhmut equal the number of soldiers who died during the 10-year Afghan war. Worse yet for Russia, the total number of Russian deaths reached 545,090 on July 2, 2024, according to the official website of Ukraine. Putin has been sending his soldiers into a meat grinder. This isn't a new situation for Russia, Zihan argues, as the human wave approach has been used by the country multiple times over the centuries. The problem for Putin comes in the availability of manpower. Zihan claims that Russia had around 8 million men in their 20s when the war started. They've lost 500,000 of those men on the battlefield, he says, with up to 1 million more having fled the country. The fleeing figures are backed by Al Jazeera, which reported that up to 1 million Russians had left their home country as of January 2024. That leaves Russia with 6.5 million bodies to throw at the Ukrainian problem. And as Zihan points out, Russia hasn't fully mobilized yet. Its draft system has targeted the ethnically and economically disadvantaged thus far, says Zihan, and we haven't really seen what the core of the country can offer in terms of sheer manpower. That should be good news for Putin in terms of maintaining his power base, were it not for a major problem. Zihan believes the Ukraine war could rage for another 8 years. Though that does sound like a long time, Zihan says to keep two things in mind. First, Russia always does long wars. It does short intimidations, he says, but Russia typically gets dragged into drawn-out conflicts that it wins simply by having more people to throw at the war. But the human wave approach creates a major challenge for Putin, bringing us to the second thing Zihan says to consider. If Russia continues with its human wave strategy and gets dragged into an 8-year war, there won't be enough Russians under age 20 left to repopulate the country once the war ends. Russia's declining population has been a key social issue in the country for several decades. In 1993, its population reached a peak of 149 million, according to the Bank of Finland Institute for Emerging Economies, or BOFIT. At the end of 2023, it stood at 146.2 million, though that falls to 144 million if you subtract those living in Crimea. Regardless, BOFIT notes that Russia's population has either been flat or has declined every year since 2000. In 2023, just 1.27 million babies were born in the country, which is the lowest birth rate for over 20 years. More worrying for Russia is that there's also been a steep decline in the number of people aged between 25 and 30 living in the country. That figure is now 5 million fewer than it was in 2013. BOFIT also notes that Russia's current population figures are being buoyed by immigration. Take that migration away, along with removing populations from Russia's occupied territories, and its population would have shrunk by about 12 million people since 2000. So Russia already has a birth rate problem. The problem will only be exacerbated if the Ukraine war drags on for as long as Zihan predicts, as an even longer war forces Russia to mobilize further. That means more young people entering the meat grinder and being killed as a result, leading to even fewer people left in Russia to have children. Zihan's opinion: when this is done, one way or another, Russia is done. Perhaps his realization of this is why Putin is recruiting so many soldiers from abroad. The Radio Times interviewer notes the June 2024 arrest of a pair of Sri Lankan generals who were accused of aiding Russia in its war. Since that arrest, several outlets have suggested those generals, and others like them, have been duped into fighting the war. They don't want to be there. They didn't realize they will be fighting in Ukraine. Still, Putin wouldn't care either way. He simply gets more men to add to his human wave approach. Zihan notes that this appears to be part of Russia's strategy. That doesn't surprise me at all. There are Nigerians fighting in Ukraine. There are foreign exchange students that the Russians have press-ganged into fighting in Ukraine. So this is not a new strategy for the Russians. He notes that Russia used this strategy extensively during the Cold War too, leading to Russia forming strange press-ganged brigades of foreign soldiers that it doesn't advertise. Perhaps Putin's use of it now is both a recognition of the difficult situation Russia finds itself in when it comes to its population, as well as a sign of desperation. Get anybody it can into the meat grinder to try and wear Ukraine down. So where does all of this leave Putin? He faces a war that could be drawn out for many years, which could potentially result in the loss of millions more Russians. The younger population would bear the brunt of these losses, not only feeding into Russia's current population challenges, but also presenting labor issues once the war concludes. Putin also faces a resurgent Ukraine that's able to establish pockets of air superiority while using weapons supplied by its Western allies to strike Russia in its own territory. Speaking of the West, it's collectively becoming more confident in crossing Russia's red lines, with the rhetoric from NATO suggesting that it's preparing for an upcoming war with Russia. Putin is trying to balance an extremely delicate situation. If Zihan is correct, Russia's missteps in the war, combined with existing societal issues, are chipping away at the strongman image that has been so essential to his leadership. With that image weakened, it may only take one major event, such as the starving out of Crimea or the loss of the war entirely, to finally put an end to Putin's time as Russia's president. But what do you think? Is there any chance that Putin may lose his seat of power before the Ukraine war ends, or is his position stronger than Zihan suggests? Share your opinions in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out why Russia is on the brink of collapse, or click this other video instead.